This happened about 37 years ago, so some of the events that happened are now long forgotten, but the main events are burned deeply into my memory and shall be until the day I die. I know many of you will find my story hard to believe, but it did happen and scared the crap out of me. It happened to me and my then at the time boyfriend, who later became my husband and now ex-husband, Alec. If what I'm about to tell you would have just happened to me, I may have just thought it was my imagination running rampant, but we both experienced it. On this particular evening, Alec came over to pick me up from my parents' home for a date. We decided to eat at one of our favorite burger joints. We went through the drive-thru and we opted to eat in the car so that we could have each other to ourselves and be able to chat without interference from others. Everything was going fine, normal. Then after we ate, we decided to go parking, for we were 17 and that's what teenagers want to do. We went to a road that we had gone to before to make out. The road was perfect for making out, as there was a field and a farm on one side, and you could see houses from there, and they were set far apart from each other. We take off from the restaurant and head for the road. This is where things start to get weird. All of a sudden I got the feeling of being watched. You know the feeling. It felt like someone was watching us from the back seat, and I was scared and freaked out. I just knew that there was no one in the back. The only time Alec and I had ever been out the car was when he came to get me from my parents' house. I desperately tried to ignore the feeling, but I had to look, and summoned up all the courage and did, already knowing no way could anyone be there. And yep, no one. Yet the feelings didn't go away, and throughout our drive, I had to periodically check the back seat, only to find it, as you guessed it, empty. Just as empty as the time before, and the time before that. We finally arrive at the road, as we called it. We came through the back. We knew the name of it then, but it has since erased from my memory. We start making out, and I'm still feeling uncomfortable, with the fear and feeling of being watched persisting. Here I have to say that neither I nor my boyfriend were on drugs or under the influence of alcohol. But not too long into our makeout session, things got even stranger. I started to feel different, act different, and I wasn't like I was myself. Well, at least not fully. It was like someone or something was trying to take over my body, and only had just so much of hold. It felt like I was becoming a passenger in my own body, and the feeling of being watched had left. Even Alec was acting differently. It was very hard to explain. The way we touched, kissed, and the things we said and so forth were completely different. Our sessions didn't last long when we pulled back from each other, and both said the same thing, that we need to get off the road. Both of us had an uneasy feeling, a feeling that something bad was imminent. We knew that we weren't acting ourselves. I mean, after being around someone for a year or so, you know how each other acts when making out, and we both definitely weren't acting right. Yet we had no control over it. So we straightened our clothes and booked it off the road. I still to this day don't understand what exactly happened to us or why, but whatever you were, I'd rather not encounter you again. This next story commences on April of '87. Alec and I had been married for around 2.5 years now, and had just recently moved. We were in our 20s, and very excited to be moving into our home. We'd also purchased our first puppy, a beautiful Australian Shepherd mix who we affectionately nicknamed Specs. Our life consisted of work, each other, making a home, and our fur baby, Specs. I need to mention the home we moved into had been Alex's grandparents. His father had died in the home back in the 70s from a heart attack, in what later became our boys' room. I never got to meet his grandfather. I met his grandmother when Alec and I started dating, and I adored her. But her declining health meant that she was placed in a nursing home by Alec's mother. She didn't last long after going there, and died at the same time this story begins in April of '87 in the nursing home. Some background on Grandma. She was born in Poland and came over to the US as a young girl, met and fell in love with his grandfather. Grandma was the type of woman who had to make sure you were fed and watered, even though if you had just eaten, there was still something of it. Saying you could just eat until it wasn't good enough, she'd still find something for you to do, or eat. Even if it were candy, she wanted you to eat. I should mention this as it pertains to the story. Alec and I both had to work. We left at the same time, which was very early in the morning. Alec was working for a factory a ways from our home. I was opening crew leader at a restaurant, so with each leaving early, no food was cooked, and we just got ready, fed the dog, and went out the door, me one way, he another. After work, I headed home. When I got there, I could hear Specs whining for me in a hurry, and opened the door so that she could greet me. But she wasn't the only thing that greeted me. I'd now like to say I totally saw a ghost, but sadly, I still don't know if one was there. For what greeted me was the smell of pancakes, and as I mentioned, neither of us had cooked. I just knew it was Grandma saying hello, in a way that I would forget when Alex got home, and told him what had happened, and he wholeheartedly agreed that it was my grandma. Years flew by, as life does, with work, the birth of our sons, another dog, a cat, rabbit, birds, and multiple fish later. One day, Alex and I were talking, and he tells me he smelled his grandmother's powder. I smell it too, but there's not a ghost in sight. Then one night something strange happens. You must understand that our cat and dog do tolerate each other, but on this night, the other was left out all night. They were both up on our bed, sitting real pretty, both of them, almost side by side. I was sitting on the bed with my back against the headboard, doing something, not sure what, but I finally noticed the cat and the dog were doing strange enough things by sitting near each other, but both stared at the same corner of the room. I look thinking they'd spotted a bug, but I didn't see anything, and go back to whatever. I look again, figuring I must have missed the bug the first time, but there's still no bug, and then it hits me what's going on. They must have seen a ghost. I can't tell you how long they sat there and stared at the corner, neither one moving an inch, but it was quite a while. That's also about the time another thing started. I think I'm the only one this happened to. I know you'll think I'm crazy as well. I started hearing disembodied voices, but you could hear them faintly. And I could never make out what they were saying anyway. This only happened at night. I heard those voices until I moved out of that house, and Alec and I got a divorce, since I never heard them again. It was the house, and even the boys said that there was a ghost in the kitchen. Growing up in a small town, you often have the mentality that you know most people who you live with, which is very often the case. In mine, when I was 14, I thought I knew everybody. Obviously not by name, but for the most part by face. You may have seen them walking around in the supermarket, maybe even at the local fair or something like that. I never really knew much about Mark. He was always very much a peripheral character in my life. I was semi-aware of his existence, as I'm sure I was for most, but I didn't know anything about him. Which is why when he started speaking to me in school one day, I didn't just disregard him and spoke to him very openly, and we had polite conversation. He seemed nice. He was telling me about his pet Komodo dragon that he kept at home, which I found very fascinating. We talked, and then it was time for class, so off I went. When I went to sit down and was pulling out my pens and paper, did my friend sit next to me and start grilling me on why I was speaking to him. I didn't really understand where this was coming from until she elaborated that Mark had been creepy as hell, and that he had followed her home from the fete the year before, never speaking to her the whole time, just following her from the distance until she reached her home. This unnerved me, and in an act of solidarity, agreed to not speak to him again, as she was a very close friend. A few days passed and I hadn't seen Mark, but then I bumped into him in the hallway. We were just looking at each other intently for those few seconds before I brushed past him and carried on my way. I wasn't sure if I should say something or nothing at all, nothing being the better option in my opinion. But I think he understood from my body language that I didn't want to speak with him. The way I looked at my shoes as I walked away. Some time passed after that, and I didn't see him anymore. For the most part, I forgot about him, and he went back to being a peripheral character in my life. But that's when the periphery began bleeding through, and Mark started getting brave. I'd see him more often. If I was sitting reading a book under a tree or in the library, I might find him peeping at me through the shelves or through a bush. This, to me, even whilst writing it, sounds silly, cartoonish, and exaggerated, but I assure you, these were his very actions. There'd be times when I would speak to my friends at the lunch table, catching up over our classes and the local gossip, and he would be looking, just staring at us from the distance. We'd comment on it, but I knew he was really just staring at me. He never said anything, and whenever I looked, he'd always look away, pretending that he were doing something else. I didn't try and talk to him about it. I didn't think it were worth my time. We both knew what he was doing. Why bother addressing it, I thought. And besides, he was only 14, as was I. What was the worst that could happen? That was, of course, my mistake. A few weeks after, did the stalking truly turn up a notch. It was starting to get cold now. Winter was certainly coming in early this year, and as I was passing by some houses on my way home, did I look back because I felt like eyes were boring into the back of my neck. Not too far away was Mark, wearing a hooded sweatshirt, approaching me rapidly. Part of me thought that I could just wait until he caught up and tell him to back off. But the other part of me felt that something was very wrong about this, and I ran like my life depended on it all the way home. Just as I was reaching my door, did I turn around and see him panting and running, nearly reaching the door itself, which I slammed shut just in time before he arrived. I didn't want to know why he was chasing me, but when I opened the door all panicked and panting, it alerted my father. My father instantly called the police, and having a friend in law enforcement in a small town really does make a difference. They immediately sent a car out, and Mark was found pretty quickly. When they picked him up, they searched him, as there was something very ominous about the way he was dressed. There was a knife concealed in his pants. It was huge. My parents were absolutely horrified. After that day, I and the rest of the town didn't see Mark again. I didn't want to ask my dad what happened, but I just knew that I wouldn't be seeing him and that he wouldn't be bothering me anymore. It's been some time since this occurred. Maybe I should ask for details. Nonetheless, Mark, let's never meet again. Back in 2013, I was living with my ex at the time, who lived near a nice country village, and I was in between jobs at the time. I picked up a job at a local garden centre. It was casual retail work, fairly decent pay, and easygoing enough that I could take coffee breaks frequently and wear basically whatever I liked, as long as I wore my work polo shirt. I was working distance from my ex's house, and full of people of all ages who were the most lovely people I'd ever met. Most of the regular customers who came into the garden centre were usually sweet old people who would visit the cafe because we had free teas and discounted lunches for old age pensioners if they had a store card. You could often get to know all of them, and some of them we even gave nicknames to. Most of them were like Pink Hair Lady, who was a badass 80-year-old grandma who wore a tasseled leather jacket who had bright pink hair. Then there was the campervan couple, who used to drive a really cool campervan with bright orange flowers painted on it. You get the idea. Creepy artist man though. He gave most of the young girls weird vibes. He wore a straw hat, was in his late 40s, and had round gold-trimmed glasses, and would wear strange graphic shirts with naked women or Professional Pussy Patrol written on them. He always wore ripped jeans where his knees were always hanging out of them, which were perpetually dirty with paint or mud. He had this strange half smile that would never leave his face, and a kind of leer that made people uncomfortable. He would take off his glasses and clean them constantly, which made you feel like he was trying to get a better look at the girls who worked there, especially the younger ones. Anyway, it was a roasting hot summer's day, and I had gratefully accepted the job of watering the hanging baskets outside, where I could avoid the humid, sweaty heat of the greenhouses. I was wearing black shorts and my red polo, as well as my tool belt to prune dead-head plants as I went. With the hose in my hand and sunglasses on my face, I was busy, but enjoying the solitary job at the quietest part of the garden centre. Well, hello there. Out of practically nowhere, he slipped out behind some wooden trellises and looked me up and down, smiling with his weird, too small teeth. His eyes lingered on me for what felt like an uncomfortable few seconds, and I turned off my hose and asked him if he needed anything. He shook his head and kind of shrugged, still smirking at my legs. "Okay, sir. Have a nice day. Let me know if you need anything." And I continue and turn to carry on watering. "I've never seen you here. Are you new?" "Huh? Me? Oh, well, I've been here about 8 months now. I must have missed the memo that a beauty like you started. You have a nice tan. You look young." "Oh, thanks. I'm 23. Anyway, I have to get back to work." "Nice to meet you, Casey." I suddenly remembered my name badge and got slightly irritated that he knew my full name. I made a beeline for the smoking area where the tool shed was as an excuse to grab some smaller gardening gloves, and by the time I returned to the floor, fortunately, he had left. As the weeks went by, he would come into the store often, usually mid-afternoon coincidentally, or so I thought, as it was around the time I started my shift. Most of the time, I was the only cashier, so I would have to serve him. He would buy the most smallest, pointless things, like floristry wire or a tiny bag of birdseed. It seemed like he would make a purposeful purchase with the intention of interacting with me. He would make comments about my appearance, statements mostly like, "You have your hair different today. Yesterday you had it down. You have new glasses. That's a different lip color to yesterday." He would always announce my name loudly and deliberately during every interaction. I felt uncomfortable, but I was 23 and just politely shrugged it off. Around Christmas time, I was decorating the artificial trees, and he cornered me in the forest at the very back of the store. He jumped out from behind and made me jump, to which I was kind of pissed about him doing because I dropped a glass ornament and it shattered. He bent down and tried to help in grabbing my wrist and telling me not to touch the glass. His grip was scarily tight and forceful, and his hands were clammy and gross. I slipped my hand out of his grip and asked if I could assist him with anything. That's when things got weird. He pulled out a leaflet from his back pocket and told me he was an artist and had a Christmas art show happening at the local church hall, and he wanted me to go with him. He told me that he was a painter, and he thought that I would enjoy his work. I had never indicated any interest in art to him, or anyone else for that matter, which is why I thought this request in particular was a bit bizarre. I asked him if he wanted me to pin the leaflet to the local events board, and he reached out and touched my arm and said, "No, the invitation is specifically for you." He pointed his finger and jabbed it into my breast and said, "You." So I'm standing there in the dark corner of the store, obscured from view by artificial Christmas trees, and just kind of cornered by this guy who was touching me. I cringed away and said that I was busy with my boyfriend that day, and I kind of scampered away. I remember feeling really strange after that. The fact he grabbed my wrist and jabbed my finger into my chest the way he did. I told a few of my colleagues about it, and they all told me that they would warn me next time he was in the store, and that maybe I could just hang out in the storeroom until he left. Well, that memo must have missed a few of the temporary Christmas staff, because one day I get told by one of them, "Your friend is asking for you at the tills." It wasn't unusual for my friends to stop by, as it was a fairly popular place for gifts. So thinking it was maybe my ex's mother or something, I head to the till, and there he is. He's holding a piece of paper. I cringe, but he had seen me now, so I walk over and ask what he needs from me. He passed the paper over and asked me to open it. Folded up was a drawing of me, with exaggerated breasts and cartoon-like eyes, watering the hanging baskets in a very sexual kind of position. I kind of stood there and said thank you, but I couldn't keep it, as I thought it was inappropriate to take gifts from customers. I handed it back to him, and he kind of looked at me with this angry state. He turned around and left without another word. By this point, I'd had enough. I knocked on my manager's door and told him about the whole scenario that had just occurred, and all the previous interactions I had had with him over the past year. He watched the CCTV and agreed that it was so strange the way he gave me the gross picture, and told me he would talk to him if he ever came back. He praised me for my reaction to his advances, and said I was doing the right thing and he would try and see him off next time. The next day was a Sunday, and I was not due in at work. My boss calls me and tells me he just received a call from HQ, stating that an anonymous caller had called in to report a member of staff inappropriately coming onto a customer. The staff member they had described and named was me. The caller had said that I had been inappropriate towards him at work, offered to sleep with him, and had led him on and obviously been promiscuous, and that I had been pursuing him for over a year. The jerk even described a fictitious relationship we had, and ranted loudly about how I had been cheating on my boyfriend before hanging up. HQ luckily didn't believe a word, as my manager had already mentioned the guy to one of the higher-ups, but they thought it was wise to let me know about this crazy guy, and suggest that I report it into the police. The next day I did just that. The officer I spoke to said that he matched the description of a man who was a local pest, someone who often harasses young girls in the local area, and was also known to stalk girls in his car, and had attempted to abduct a young woman not 4 years ago. The police officers assured me they would file a report and talk to him officially, and that he was not allowed in the garden center or anywhere near me again, and if he did, I was to call the police and he would be arrested. Unfortunately though, it never stopped him sending a ranting letter to my workplace, addressed it to me, saying he would kill himself if I didn't take him back, and receive the gift he drew for me. Fortunately, the police saw this as an unsolicited contact, and he was thankfully arrested. I was 21 and recently became a police officer, and was also recently dumped. So my friend suggested Tinder. As a 21-year-old and new cop, I had the I'm invincible and I can take on anyone mentality. I matched with a very good-looking out-of-my-league female. We chatted and eventually set up a date to meet. She said she had a great open field to look at stars and hang out, and we could meet up at her house. So the night came, and I was excited, and she seemed to be excited when I picked her up. She guided me to the field, and it looked nice. Open space, woods, deer, and other wildlife. In the field, I noticed really dim headlights in the distance. Then, the van started driving towards us, and pulled up right in front of us, almost close enough to block me from going forward. I told her to stay in the car and that I would go say hi. I grabbed my flashlight, the one I had in the car, and walked up. In the front driver's side of the van, there was a decently sized man. I asked him what was going on, and if he could back up a little bit. He was very polite. He said that he was the owner of the property, and said that he didn't mean to scare us. He told me he'd been having trouble with poachers on this property for a while, and just wanted to make sure we weren't going to be shooting at anything. I assured him that we only came out to look at some stars and wildlife, and he was perfectly okay with that, and told me to have a nice date and drove away. After that, the girl was texting non-stop. Around an hour later, I saw headlights coming towards us again, this time at a really fast pace. We hopped in the car, and I moved it to a more defensive position. The same man came close enough to almost hit my car. She hopped out of the car at that point and ran towards the guy. I immediately knew I was screwed. I got out and gave them commands to back up and get on the ground. Neither of them complied, obviously. He then proceeded to charge me and knock me over to the ground. Luckily, I was able to get him on his back and get him up, and saw my date grab a metal pipe from the van. She told me they had a gun and to give them all the money in my truck and that I wouldn't get hurt. Of course, with my I'm invincible mentality, I said no. She started to cry and saying that she didn't want to hurt me. He then started to go back towards the car. At that point, I told them I was a cop, drew my concealed firearm and lay on the ground. After a moment of shock from all of us, they complied. I was able to call 911, tell them my name and badge number, and that I had two at gunpoint and needed backup immediately. I gave our dispatcher the best directions I could to this field while on the phone. They both fled. Again, stupid young cop mentality. I chased him for about 30 seconds and heard 3 loud pops and saw muzzle flash. My invincibility mentality went right out the window. I ran like hell back towards my car and peeled the hell out of there. I went back to the area, the one I picked her up in, called dispatch again, and had officers come to that location. Of course, the first officer to pull me up was my sergeant and my field training officer. Of course, they were both completely understanding and didn't give me any shit about it at all. The most used word was dumbass and stupid rookie. I hopped in their car and went towards the field. The van luckily was still there. I was told to shut my mouth and only come out if they started getting shot at. They cleared the area and started looking in the van. They found meth right on the center console and searched the car. What scared me the most was when my field training officer and sergeant came back to the patrol car, let me out, and told me to come look in the back of the van. Both of them were pale, looked horrified. But there in the back of the van were several knives, duct tape, lighter fluid, and a decent amount of rifle ammunition, handcuffs, and what looked to be dried blood. In the front passenger side, we found an AR-15 style rifle, 2 more handguns, and we called for immediate backup and detectives. When they investigated the blood, it turns out it wasn't blood. The plates had been stolen, and the van was reported stolen. I still get shit about the whole encounter, but luckily, no one got hurt. I will never use online dating again. Ever. 3 years ago, I was living in downtown Los Angeles, not far from the convention center. I tended to shop late at night because the traffic was low and the normally crowded grocery store was mostly empty. It was a Saturday night around 11:30 p.m. and I was stressed out from a project I'd been working on that had to be ready by Monday for an event. The stray cat I had rescued a year earlier was adding to my aggravation with her constant whining for the one specific type of food she is willing to eat. I figured getting out for a bit and going to the store would ease my mind, as well as my cat's hunger. So I headed out. The parking lot my car was in was about 200 paces down the street from the apartment building. I made it there, went to the store, found the light blue can of Fancy Feast tuna and gravy grilled that my cat oh so desired, and headed home. As I walked from the parking lot back to the building, up the dark and empty street, I noticed the figure of a person rapidly approaching in my peripheral vision. That's not good, I thought. And not a moment later, I heard a voice behind me calmly say, "Hey man." And I turned to see a tall guy in a red hat aiming a gun at my chest. I'm 6'1", and this guy towered over me. My immediate thought was not one of fear, but simply, "You have to be kidding me." As I heard a second man approach from behind me, another thought entered my mind that still chokes me up to this day. If this guy shoots me, it's gonna kill my mother. I dropped the bag of Fancy Feast on the sidewalk and handed the guy my wallet, but he didn't lower the gun. Slowly I started to move away, hoping this incident was coming to an end, hoping he wouldn't fire, and never catching a glimpse of the second guy behind me. I started towards my building, which was a mere 50 feet away, keeping my eyes on the guy with the gun in case he decided to do something. Then the thought entered my mind that these guys were going to see where I lived. I didn't know what to do, but before I could act, the robber in the red hat yelled out, "Hey, where you going? What else you got?" Shit, I thought. My iPhone. I couldn't believe I was about to give this thug my phone on top of everything else. I was pretty far away at this point, and it probably wasn't the smartest decision, but I figured I could maybe convince him he's gotten everything and he'd leave me alone. I told him I didn't have anything else, and he responded, "What about your phone?" Shit. He told me if I didn't hand it over, he was going to kill me, and slowly began approaching again, gun raised. I tried to maneuver myself to place a tree between me and him in case he decided to start shooting, but it was useless. He came up to me, gun aimed again, and I handed him my phone. He turned it on to make sure it worked, then went back to staring at me with a horrible expression. Silence. It was then that I asked him to please let me go, and with one final intimidating stare, he turned and walked away, grabbing the bag of fancy feast as the other guy vanished down the street. My heart was about to pound out my chest. I ran to my front door, unlocking it as fast as I could, peeking over my shoulder to make sure they weren't returning. And I got inside. Once in my apartment, I knew I had to call someone, but I had no phone. I jumped on Facebook and messaged a few friends who I knew would be around. One responded and called the police, who arrived at my door a half hour later. We went downstairs and woke up the manager, explaining exactly what had happened. The police wanted to check the security cameras and the incident was captured on video, but sadly the street was so dark, you couldn't make anything out. You could, however, see the blinking light of the phone for a moment as the robber in the red hat turned it on. The cops asked me if I had Find My iPhone activated, which I didn't. I was new to the iPhone scene at the time, as well as smartphones in general, and didn't even know that it was a feature. My bad. They told me that most criminals are smart enough to deactivate it anyway after stealing a phone. The police left, and I returned to my apartment, feeling alive somehow. Not scared or sad, but alive, and slightly bad for my poor cat, who wasn't going to get her food of choice that night. You would think this incident was scary enough, something that would be rough for anyone to go through, but it was really only the beginning. I cancelled my credit cards. I changed every online password I could think of, Facebook, Twitter, and the like. My friend and I went to the mall and I got a new phone, and I began to think that my days of living in downtown LA were soon coming to an end, and it was time to move. Replacing everything stolen, my driver's license, credit cards, was an expected pain, but I got through it. A week passed, and I was afraid to go out to my car at night. I realized this was a problem when I had no choice but to be out late one night, and for a day leading up to it, all I could think about was how I was going to have to walk the same path from the parking lot late at night, again. I asked a friend to pick me up instead, and that night I had him drop me off in front of the building and watch me until I got inside. Another week passed, and things died down a bit. That was until one afternoon, when I walked into the building, talking to my mum on my new phone. I noticed a guy entering the building ahead of me. A tall guy I'd never seen in the building before. Keep in mind I'd been there a few years and knew what almost everyone looked like. I immediately got a bad feeling and cautiously entered the building to find him standing in the lobby laughing with someone. He turned to look at me, and I felt like a knife stabbed me in the heart. It was him, the guy who had aimed a gun at me and threatened my life not 2 weeks before. If my gut telling me it was him wasn't enough, the look of horror that washed over his face, widening his eyes, and locking his stare on me, was a dead giveaway. I knew it was him. He knew it was me. And we both knew something even worse. We were living in the same building. Somehow I pretended I didn't recognize him. I sold it pretty well and continued casually talking to my mum as I headed up the stairs. Once in my apartment, I told her I had just seen the robber in the lobby of my building. She told me that that wasn't a problem. There was no way someone was dumb enough to commit a robbery 50 feet from their own front door. I tried to convince myself she was right. It couldn't be him. Not possible. I waited an hour before heading downstairs to talk to the manager about what happened. I found her outside the building, emptying trash into the dumpster, and explained the situation. My robber may be living in the building, and we may have a problem. As I described the guy to her, things suddenly got even more tense when the building's back door opened, and out he walked, with a young woman who was pushing a baby stroller accompanying him. I immediately changed the subject to sound like we weren't even talking about him. When he was out of sight and earshot, I told my manager that was the guy. She told me he had moved into the building a mere 3 days before the robbery had happened, and that she had been getting bad vibes from him ever since. She'd seen him hanging around and talking with some dark-looking characters, gangbangers, and the kind of people you don't want to mess with. The kind of people who would not hesitate to take you out if they thought that you were even the slightest threat to them. The obvious thing to do was to call the police. Yet somehow this situation was not that simple. My manager had been living out there for a long time and had a better idea of how things could play out than I did. She believed if I began pointing fingers, this guy had a lot of friends who he could turn to in order to get rid of me, if it meant his freedom. And the one person who could royally screw up his life with one phone call to the police. It was decided that before doing anything, I needed to be somewhere safe. It was time to move, and the move needed to be quick. My manager told me they were going to waive the fee for breaking my lease, and just told me to get out ASAP. In spite of the usual horror that hunting for an apartment can be, I found a place in just a few days in a much nicer and quieter area, and decided to take it. For the next few days until my move-in date, I didn't see the guy again. I was paranoid, mostly at night, even in my apartment. I would actually push the boxes I'd pack my things in against the door just in case. I don't know why I didn't just go stay at a friend's house. I was extremely nervous every time I walked to my car and would find myself jogging. It was a rough several days, but finally, it was moving day. My friend came over to help me get bigger items out of the apartment and into the U-Haul. He was paranoid about helping, considering what had happened. So I was cracking little jokes with him every time we saw someone, saying it was the robber. It was funny, until the actual guy who had robbed me was around the corner, walking right past us in the narrow hallway. If there was any uncertainty that it was him, it was all washed away. He was wearing the same red hat. It was very distinct and impossible to mistake. Not only that, he turned his head as he passed us, as if trying to hide his face. It wasn't until later that I told my friend that was the guy. I didn't want to make him any more nervous. My friend told me he figured something was up, because he had noticed the guy was concealing his face as well. There was only one more thing left to get out of the apartment before leaving the building one last time. As my friend and I got off the elevator and headed towards my apartment, number 419, the door right beside it opened, and out walked the robber in the red hat. The apartment next door, 420, which was literally 1 foot from my door. This whole time, he had not only been living in the same building, but a single foot away. I don't know who could believe it less, me or him. What amazing odds. My friend and I grabbed my last item, and I hurried it into the truck, and we were gone. I planned to call the police the next day from my new apartment, but I didn't have the chance. They called me first. A female detective, I'll call Janet, asked me if I was willing to come in and look at photos and a police lineup. I told her that there'd be no need to do that, because I knew the guy wouldn't be in her lineup, because I knew exactly where he was, and proceeded to give her his address. She told me that she would call me back in a day or two. 2 days later, she called me and asked if I'd be willing to come in and talk to her. I headed to the police department near downtown and found myself sitting in a stereotypical interrogation room, like the ones you see on TV. Janet asked me to tell her the entire story from the beginning. They told me they had looked in on the guy, but the law prohibited her from telling me anything about him. She took out a rather large collection of mugshots and placed them all in front of me, perhaps 15 pictures in total, and asked if any of them looked like the guy who had robbed me. I went through each picture, narrowing them down, before getting to the last 2 possibilities. I made my choice, and I could tell from her expression that she was pleased with my decision. I asked if I'd chosen correctly, and she said she couldn't answer, but did say I'd done a good job. I said that if they already had the guy's mugshot on file, this obviously wasn't the first time he'd had a run-in with the law. Again, she couldn't answer, but gave me a non-verbal nod of the head in compliance, and told me that we would be in touch. A few days later, the phone rang. The number was hidden, so I knew it was the police. This time, it was a man, Jim. He told me the police had done their research, and they were going to get the guy, and asked me a few basic questions, mainly about the baby and the woman I saw him with behind the building that day. I guess they wanted to know if they were walking into a potential hostage situation, or one where a baby would be in danger. He also got my iPhone serial number, in case they found it, which would obviously be the smoking gun. He told me to expect a call the next day. The next day, I found myself back at the police station at a table with Jim and Janet. They'd picked the guy up, but not found any of my belongings. Obviously, he had stolen the phone to sell it, so it was probably long gone. And the fancy feast? Well, the credit cards were useless since I'd cancelled them, and it would have been completely stupid to hang on to the wallet. I asked them how he had reacted when they were arresting him. They told me, like someone who knew it was coming. No surprise at all. In spite of no physical evidence, they were convinced he was the robber, based on certain things they couldn't disclose, and it was then they told me a second person had been robbed the same night, by someone matching my guy's description. Unfortunately, the person had vanished, and the cops were unable to get in touch with him. I was it. My word apparently was the only evidence against the Red Hat robber. Some time passed, and I didn't hear anything else about the situation. I hoped it had died down and was in the past. If they let the guy go, there was nothing I could do about it. I was somewhere I felt safe and was willing to just move on. Then one day while driving, my phone rang and the word hidden came up. I answered to hear Janet's voice. It was then that she told me in a few days she would be driving me to the LA County Courthouse to give testimony against the robber at a hearing. I felt my heart drop. I don't like public speaking. I didn't want to see that guy in person ever again, and I was going to have to sit on a witness stand with him staring at me and tell everything that happened to lawyers and a judge and who knew who else. The morning came, and Janet and I got into an unmarked police car and headed to the courthouse. Once inside, we were told to sit on a bench and wait. It felt like forever, but finally I was called in. I found myself in a huge courtroom with literally hundreds of people filling the seats staring at me. And there at the table, the robber. He was wearing a blue prison garb. When I saw his face, I again got that same shot to the chest I felt when I'd seen him in the lobby of my old apartment. I knew it was him. I had to recount the entire story to everyone with him staring at me the whole time. Then, that moment you always see in TV crime shows and movies comes. The lawyer asked me if the person who robbed me was sitting in the room, and if I could point him out. The robber and I locked eyes, and he began to slowly shake his head, quietly telling me, no. Not in a threatening way, but in a scared shitless, if this guy says yes, then I'm screwed way. I pointed at him and said it was him. His head dropped, as did the heads of several people in the audience, family and friends, I guess. After that day, I heard nothing else for the longest time. Many months passed, and I was hoping that was the end of it. I honestly didn't care much about what happened to him. If anything, I did figure they'd call me. Then one day, my Skype started logging in and out all by itself. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I realized I'd never changed my Skype passwords after the phone was stolen. So many to change I'd overlooked that one. And wherever my stolen phone was all this time later, someone was playing with it. And I realized I had so many conversations with people about the robbery over Skype text, and due to my mistake of not changing that password, whoever had the phone could read every one of them. The police had told me there was no way to recover the phone, so I figured all I could do was change the password, which I did. And Skype stopped logging in and out by itself. I called the police and asked for an update on my case, and they told me there currently was none, but they would be in contact soon. Some time later, I woke up to my phone ringer, and the caller was listed as hidden. I answered, and it was the district attorney. She began explaining to me that there was no evidence against the Red Hat robber other than my word, and in a he said type of case, there can be no conviction. The robber had sat in jail for nearly 6 months at that point, which felt like a good lesson, and the attorney told me she was calling to see if I was okay with dropping the whole thing, in spite of her completely believing he was guilty. She said she had felt I had been through enough, and if we pushed on with the case, it would be a nightmare. The robber's attorney would hire a person whose one job would be to find dirt on me and turn me, the victim, into the villain. She threw some truth at me that because I'm white and he's black, they would play the race card and say I was just trying to put another poor black guy away. She told me they would bring up everything they could find about me that could help set this guy free, and sadly, that was their job, and ultimately, it would all be for nothing. I asked her that if I said it was okay to let him go, would I ever have to hear about this ordeal again? She told me that the moment I hung up, this entire thing would be over for me, but not to worry. In her experience, these guys never learn, and she has no doubt he'll do something again and wind up right back in jail. It happens almost every time. It was then that she told me something I did not know that spun the entire situation in my mind. The guy who had robbed me was only 16 years old. He was 6'7" and looked much older. She confirmed that the baby was in fact his, and that he'd been spending his time in jail learning crafts and partaking in whatever kinds of social activities they had in places like that. He was just a stupid kid. One stupid enough to rob someone 50 feet from his own front door. I never heard anything else about the case, or about the red-hatted robber, but before the DA hung up, she said one final thing I'll always remember. The crime in this case was not a stolen iPhone or credit cards. It wasn't the threat of my life, or even the stack of fancy feast. The real crime was that, whether I knew it or not, this guy had put a permanent scar on my brain that I would carry for the rest of my life. I would never forget this had happened, and it would change my life forever. My stolen sense of security was the real crime. I still go out walking at night, and hardly ever think about what happened. If anything, I feel it made me stronger. I know the Red Hat robber is out there somewhere. I know that he's just a stupid kid. I hope that this ordeal was as much a lesson for him as it was for me. Whether it was or not, I do hope that we never meet again. I grew up with 4 older brothers. For context, I'm a girl. They got me into League of Legends, and since I was young, I have been hooked. So, as far as social life goes, it was pretty much spent online. By the time I was 19, I was pretty good at the game, and my brothers, for the most part, had all but left and no longer played. It was just me. I was very much into my cyber world. I had built up an army of friends online, and I'm gonna be honest, being a girl playing an online game is a bit of a confidence booster. Some of these friends I'd grown really close with, even added them on Skype, Discord, WhatsApp, and we would chat all the time. And we couldn't wait until we could log back into our virtual world to carry on doing whatever it was we needed to do. I had a job working in a bar, which meant that my hours didn't always coincide with other people for gameplay, but we still had a good time when it did. I was recently single, as my online boyfriend had dumped me for another girl, but I wasn't salty, as we'd never even met in real life. This is important later. Cue in Gareth, or Stormbreaker 43. He and I were regular friends. We'd known each other for a while and we were part of the same group, but we didn't talk all that much, although we did have each other on social media, as back in the day I tended to be very liberal with who I added. He and I started talking a bit more. He'd always compliment me on my looks, telling me how gorgeous I was, and that he really wanted to meet me. He never told me where he lived, but he had heard through the grapevine, and what other people knew about me, that I lived in a relatively medium-sized city in the Midwest. He already knew which one. I just want to be a little bit more anonymous for the sake of the story. To cut a long story short, he started grilling all my friends to get personal information about me, but he was sneaky about it. He'd throw in these questions very carefully, as some of my friends wouldn't even notice that he were asking, and the fact that he varied his sources when it came to sourcing questions meant that no one noticed early on. When he'd gathered enough information about me, did he manage to locate the bar I was working at. I was just doing my thing. It was about 10 p.m. and it was getting a little bit quiet, as the bar is a bit out of the city limits. I remember that I was just cleaning a glass when I turn around and I kind of do a double take. He looked familiar, but I couldn't think of where. He comes up basically running to the bar screaming my name. And after a few seconds did it hit me. Instead of being overcome with joy as he expected me to be, I was instantly paralyzed to the spot. How the hell did he locate me, I thought. I was very careful about giving out information and never told anyone specifically where I worked. When I asked him how he found me, after recovering from the initial shock, he said that he was just, and I quote, passing through the area and needed a drink. I asked him, "You do know it's illegal to drink and drive, right?" And he said, yeah, no, just like a Coke or something. I gave him a half smile, unsure if he were lying or not, but my gut told me I couldn't trust him. I served him the drink, we chatted for a bit, but there were other patrons that required my attention, so I dismissed myself, and within about 40 minutes of me not being able to say much to him, he was on his way. I didn't play that night. I was feeling very uncomfortable. Or the next night. My friends started getting concerned, and I reached out to a few of my closest and told them what had happened. They were horrified, and told me they didn't even know he'd done that. But come to think of it, he had asked questions about me, and that's when we started piecing it together. Very quickly, he was kicked out of the friendship group because we were all very weirded out by his creepy behavior. I wish it ended there though. He'd pop up at my bar from time to time, come in, and try and talk to me as often as possible. He didn't even care that he was out the group. He was fixated on getting my attention. It got more and more. He began coming in twice a week, then 3 times, then every day. His stays would last several hours in his attempts to woo me. He would bring me flowers and chocolates, and then that moved on to other creepy things. He started saying that we were in a relationship and that he couldn't wait to move in with me. This was insane. One day, I just went up to my manager and told him I quit, and didn't come back in after that. You see, our bar is very small, and only 2 of us work there in one go. So, it's safe to say that they couldn't just put me at the back or swap my shifts around, because they'd overlap anyway. I was happy to be gone and rid of him, and after a few weeks did I find a new job elsewhere, but it didn't take him long after that to find out where it was. I didn't know how he was getting this information, and I was starting to get really paranoid. I ended up quitting League of Legends because I couldn't hack it. I was sure that someone was telling him what I was doing and where I was going, and I couldn't trust anyone. I ended up moving back to my parents' house and lied low for a little bit, and from there he didn't seem to find me. I hope to not see him again. It's been about 3 months, and I just don't understand why he would fixate on me. I really just want to be left alone. I was 18 at the time this happened. I had just graduated high school, and it was just my luck my car died when my adult life was supposed to begin. I live out in the sticks of Washington State. The next town over was an hour away from any employment or real civilization for that matter. I had to resort to taking the bus to and from anywhere I needed to go. I managed to find a job before a new college semester started, and near my work, the main bus stop was located right in front of a multiple department store. Being the main area for bus transportation, there was always a decently sized crowd of people coming and going for their connections. I felt safe enough in my environment, never being alone in that sense. On this particular day, there had been a larger crowd than normal. It was summer, and I had been seated with a book waiting on my way home. A cluster of people had been having a discussion to the right of me. Something comical happened in their socializing, and it made me look up from my book. I don't remember what happened, but I smiled at the crowd in acknowledgement at the funny, then looked around at the other people who had also witnessed the sight. Then, sigh. I made the big mistake. I'm not sure how I knew this was a mistake, but the feeling I had was one of annoyance and unsettlement, an encounter unwanted in my day. My gaze came across a tall man, standing alone and away from the others. I remember he had a patchy rat-tail moustache, oversized glasses, and salt-pepper hair. Our eyes met unintentionally, and somehow, that cued the okay for him to come over next to me, which I generally wouldn't have minded if this guy didn't immediately give off the creeper vibes when he began talking. First it was just a, "Hello, my name's Rick. How's your day?" I was polite enough to answer, already dumb with his presence. I turned back to my book, hoping to send the sign of bug off, but I knew better than to give this guy any important information about myself. He asked my name, and I replied, Rachel, a fake name. "Ah, what a pretty name," Rick replied, and then asked, "Are you in high school?" "Yes, almost done with summer school, and on my way to my summer study group." "How old are you?" "I'm 16. I really wanted to walk away with this answer at this point, and Rick stands up straighter. 16, huh? I don't reply, knowing this is going to turn weird. "Well, Rachel, I'm 32, have a part-time job, drive, although I don't have my own car, and I live with la 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 la." Rick carried on to tell me about his life, and relished in the fact on how he's single and ready to commit to a woman. Yeah. Rick then suggests that I could join him sometime at lunch, and made a few other suggestions for a date, but not asking outright, making it seem on friends' terms. I'm not that stupid. I am no longer looking at Rick, feeling creeped out and revolted at the fact that I had just told this 13-year-old grown man that I'm 16, and he's still trying to persuade me to go out with him alone. He tells me all this unwanted personal information about himself, and then he suggests a relationship? I drop my voice to a firm, cold, warning tone. That would be highly inappropriate. I am not interested. I say this loud enough to which people start taking uncertain glances in my direction. Good witnesses, if needed. Being noticed and rejected, Rick rocketed back and forth on his heels uncomfortably, then stated, "I think I'd be a good match for a woman like yourself." I stand up, and I'm fed up at this point, and I say, "No." And I walk a ways down as my bus pulls gently in on time. Rick never moved, only stared at me for another 3 minutes while the bus loaded in passengers. Thankfully, I had never run into Rick again after this encounter, but unfortunately, it would not be the last time I ran into a creeper like Rick. Apparently in small towns of Washington state, if you're polite or even glance at someone in public, it means you're ready for a long-term relationship. 3 other times I've been followed. One guy even persuaded the bus in his car. I bought a vehicle soon after, and then moved to the city of Tacoma later on. The experiences didn't faze me, and I still took the bus occasionally. I even rode a bicycle up and down now Pack Avenue all hours of the day for a shorter commute. That would take too long for a bus, but would be a waste of fuel if I took a car, and I never seriously had any weirdo encounters like that again. So the lesson here is that it's true what they say about small towns. Small town, small world, small mind. Stay alter and stay safe. This happened in the summer of 2013, when I was 27 and living in a rather large city in Texas. I lived in a historic district that had gorgeous old mansions from the late 1800s and early 1900s on one block, and crack houses on another. The area was, and still is, in a perpetual state of transition, and I lived on the cusp of these two sections. I had moved to this area in January from an even shadier part of downtown to an old house that was split into 4 units, and each of us had 1/4 of the house, so 2 upstairs and 2 downstairs, with a common foyer area where the mailboxes were. I lived in the bottom right unit, if you were looking at the house from the street. Despite the shadiness of the area and the crackheads that wandered around at night, I mostly felt safe. I liked the house, and I liked the other tenants, all female like me, and all around my age. The girl who lived in the unit across the hall from me, Gigi, was a little quirky, but she was nice and had a gorgeous King Corso called Carlo. One day in early August, I ran into Karen, who lived in a unit upstairs. She told me that she was moving out a month later to live with her boyfriend. I was a little bummed because she was nice and quiet, but otherwise I didn't give it much thought. She moved out during the day on Thursday, August 22nd, while the rest of us were at work. I had plans to go to my then boyfriend's house that evening, so I got home from work, grabbed my dog Leopold, the German Shepherd, that I had just gotten in July, and walked out the front door. I was locking up and was startled when a guy about my age came up the walkway and spoke up from right behind me. "Hey." I jumped and turned, feeling mostly okay because I had Leopold, even though he's a huge baby. He looked scary. I said hello back, and here is what followed. "Do you live here?" Yeah, I do. Why?" I know it was stupid to admit that, but I had just walked out and locked up and had my dog with me, so I didn't feel like I could reasonably deny it. "Are you moving?" "No, I believe one of the other tenants moved out recently, but we don't interact a lot, so I'm not 100% sure." "Well, her movers assaulted me today, and I wanted to press charges." "Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. Did you notice the name on the van of the moving company? If so, you could contact them and let them know what happened." He looked fine, by the way, so I don't know what he meant by assaulted. Yeah, thanks. Bye." I thought nothing of the encounter. He seemed normal-ish. So, I went on my way. I spent a few hours at my boyfriend's house and headed home. I pulled up to my house at around 9:15 to see 3 cop cars with their lights on and flashing lights and a lot of commotion in the front. I walked up to see that the glass in the front door had been busted. As I walked up, Gigi stopped me, and she was pretty hysterical. She said she was in her place when she heard a loud noise that was the glass shattering. She opened her door to lock it. Remember, we have the bottom units in the foyer, so our front doors were right at the front of the house, to see a guy running away. The glass broken, and a note on the glass which said, "Watch your back." Gigi then told me that Karen told her that she was moving out. Her movers got into a kerfuffle with some guy because he'd kept trying to aggressively sell them drugs and would not leave them alone even when they asked him to. One of the movers pushed him and all hell broke loose. When Karen and her boyfriend got into the car to drive away, this guy got into his car and followed them on the freeway, honking and trying to make them crash. They eventually lost him. I immediately knew who they were talking about and told the police and Gigi about my earlier encounter. The police wrapped things up shortly after, and our landlord, who came when Gigi called, promised to fix it the next day. They couldn't find the culprit, and I didn't know where he lived, only that it had to be close by because of how he left on foot after speaking with me. I went to bed thinking things would be okay, but I was so wrong. I went about business as usual the next day and went out with my boyfriend for a while. We returned at around 11:30 p.m. and parked his car out front, right next to mine. There was a gated parking in the back, but that night I didn't park back there. The windows and blinds were open. We were playing records and drinking scotch, and all was well, until I noticed movement from outside. It was the guy. I watched as the guy started circling my car erratically, almost like he was possessed, and dancing around the vehicle like he was getting ready for some ritual. I alerted my boyfriend, and he came to look out with me. All of a sudden, this guy goes into a frenzy and starts beating my car with a tire iron. I freak out. My boyfriend runs out and tells him to stop, and I call 911. I'm on the phone with the operator telling her what's happening, and at this point my boyfriend was yelling at the guy to stop, and the guy told my boyfriend he had a gun and would kill him as he continued to smash my car, and then moved on to my boyfriend's. The operator heard him threaten us and told us to get inside and not engage, so that is what we did. I stayed on the phone with her for a very long time and watched as he yelled incoherently at me, as it was directed at me, but I had no idea what he was saying though. I did manage to catch the words slut and whore repeatedly, and he kept yelling at me to watch my back, and continued the fierce frenzy on my vehicle. It took the cops 2.5 hours to show up. I was livid at the lack of response given the active threat and damage to property. He was nowhere to be found when they got there, but on the plus side, I figured out where he lived. He lived in an apartment complex across the street. When the police arrived, they assessed the damage to my car, and it turns out he had also decided to key my car all over. I didn't notice it when we got home because the street was rather dark and it was late, and I hadn't paid attention. On the driver's side door, it looked like he had tried to spell the word slut. Unfortunately, the police couldn't find him and were absolutely useless. I barely slept that night and was incredibly upset, but the story does not end there. On Sunday, Gigi called me again. The guy was loitering around the house and stared at it from the sidewalk. She got spooked and called the cops again, but nothing happened. They still couldn't find him, and honestly, I can't remember why he was so hard to find for them. I only remember being angry at them and him. A few nights later, Gigi heard sounds outside again and called the cops. This time, he had left a brick and another note that said, "Watch your back," but he had laid it outside my window. The same cops had shown up a few times, and as Gigi is in the foyer telling them this, she heard weird sounds and muffled talking. One of the cops looked at me quizzically and said, "Miss, did you know this gentleman before?" No. I'd never met him until he approached me on Thursday to ask me about Karen moving out." "Are you sure?" "Yeah, of course I'm sure. Are you positive you didn't have any sort of relationship with him previously? Yeah. Why are you asking? Note, I was getting really annoyed at this point. Well, I think it's a little weird that this guy seems to be focused on you. I'm wondering if, given the word he carved into your car, and what he was shouting a few nights ago, if you didn't have a previous relationship with him that ended poorly, and now he's taking it out on you. I was really angry at this insinuation. It was as though I was somehow to blame for this. It was as if, for him to do what he did, it had to be because I had done something. It could just be, because he's a psycho. I can't remember what exactly I said to the officer because I was upset, and Gigi, bless her heart, was extremely offended on my behalf. However, in between Gigi's feminist rant and my growing anger and frustration, and my dog's whining and pawing for attention, the officer said something that I didn't process until a little later. He said it was obvious I was the target of a lot of actions, not Gigi. There was only me and her there at the time, so the upstairs was empty. And if that is true, I didn't know him previously, then he thought it was likely that he approached the movers and me intentionally, and he thought it was likely he had been watching me for a while. I went back to my place shortly after, and stewed in my anger while drinking copious amounts of wine from my classy Botter box. A few nights later, we are reaching the beginning of October. I woke up in the middle of the night at around 2:30 a.m, incredibly thirsty. My room was at the back of my unit, so I walked from the back bedroom to the kitchen, which was in the middle of the unit. I'm not sure why, but for some reason I had the urge to peep through the crack in my blinds in the living room, at the front that faced the street. And there he was. My house was pitch black, so he couldn't see me, but there he was, standing on the sidewalk in front of my unit, just staring at my windows. I jumped back and started hyperventilating. I made sure the doors were locked and contemplated calling the police, but axed that idea because I was pissed at them. I stayed standing and watching from the cracks in the blinds. He barely moved for almost an hour, and when he walked away, it was obvious from the way he moved he was either intoxicated or high on something. I made sure the doors were locked, ran back to my bed, and checked on Leopold, who was snoozing peacefully in his own bed. I couldn't fall back asleep. I was anxious all the next day. I was also scared that Leopold was home alone, and was scared that maybe the guy would break my window this time and get into my unit and somehow hurt my dog. I was a nervous wreck. The next night I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m. I made my way to the front, and there he was again. That night played out like the night before. This sick dance went on for weeks, until he started leaving the sidewalk and walking into the yard, and getting closer to the house in my window. I watched every night as he got closer, and I was terrified. Eventually, one of my friends gave me his gun, and another one gave me his shotgun, and yes, I know how to use them both. I have my concealed carry license, but didn't have my own guns at the time, because I was in the process of choosing which gun I wanted to buy. They didn't really make me feel better though. Those weeks were some of the longest of my life, and every night was the same. I didn't sleep, work was hard because I wasn't sleeping, and I was worried about my dog. I was just a ball of panic and fear for most of October. I watched him watching my windows and getting closer and closer, until one night he was right outside of it. Right outside the window. I was frozen on the other side, scared that if I were to move too much or look through the crack, he would see me. Somehow, I worked up the courage to peek a little, and my blood froze. He was pissing on the house right under my window. About a year prior, I had seen a movie with Sally Field called An Eye for an Eye, where she obsessively stalks her daughter's rapist/killer, who got off on a technicality. She follows him while he's working delivering groceries. After he's delivered groceries to this woman's house one day, she watches as he urinates on this woman's fence before he leaves. He returns shortly thereafter to rape and kill the woman. So needless to say, I was freaked the hell out. I called my landlord in the morning and let him know I needed to move, and relayed some of the information and asked him to let me out of the lease. He agreed. He knew he could easily find another tenant, so he wasn't worried about letting me go. A little while later, I was driving around with Leopold, just to cruise and listen to music and mull over my living situation. I was still on my street, but further up in the nice part, with the old mansions. I loved this part of the street, and it's a relatively well-known street in my city. I was admiring the house when I saw a sign that said there was a back house for lease. I had loved this house since I was a little girl, and it was a huge corner lot with a massive gate circling the backyard, where the back house was located. I called immediately. I spoke to the owner, who said he could show it to me that afternoon. So I called my mum to come and look at it with me, and I loved it. He didn't mind that I had a dog, and said the dog could have the run of the yard as long as I cleaned up after him. He asked why I was moving, and I explained the situation to him. He told me he was a retired police chief of a relatively big nearby city, and assured me that no one was getting through his fence and security system, and that he would look after me. I moved later that week, and ended up spending 4 years nearly in that back house. I'm afraid the end is very anticlimactic. The story is not as scary as others might have hoped, but I was terrified during the duration of this time. I never saw the guy again, despite being in a close proximity, and I never ever want to. I do have photos of the damage to my car, the door, and a photo of him lurking across the street. The photo is grainy, and was taken before camera phones got all snazzy, and I had to adjust the shadows, but he's there, staring. If you're wondering why I didn't move during this time to live with my parents or my boyfriends, it's because they didn't have room for me and my dog, and I didn't have the funds to break my lease, though it ended up not being an issue in the end. This happened to me in Thailand a few years ago. I've always been a backpacker, and have never really ran into trouble throughout my travels. I've also since been back to Thailand, and see this as an isolated experience, so it didn't prevent me from continuing to travel. In fact, I'm on a flight to Bali right now. I'm writing this on my iPad. Thailand is a backpacker haven, seeing millions of travelers every year, especially solo backpackers. They come for the culture, good food, and of course, amazing beaches. However, as much of a paradise as it is, you have to keep your wits about you, as it does have a seedy underbelly. The great thing about traveling solo is that you end up meeting a lot of other travelers, especially in hostels. This experience started in a hostel on the island of Koh Lanta. I had met this Australian dude, and he was keen on getting the party started. I also felt in the mood, and together, we started rallying together at the other hostels for a pretty crazy pre-drinking session, complete with creating our own buckets full of Thai whiskey and some off-brand Red Bull called M150. Word on the street, this energy drink has traces of speed in it. It goes without saying that we were all pretty drunk within an hour or so. The Australian guy kept going on about a place called the Monkey Bar, and that he had seen signs about it advertising a party beach. When we ran out of drinks, we didn't really know where to go, and the Aussie guy kept insisting that we go to Monkey Bar. With all of us being wasted, we decided, why not? We went outside the hostel and hailed a pickup truck, capable of carrying the 10 of us. When we informed the driver that we wanted to go to the Monkey Bar, he gave us a weird look and kept saying no. All of us, being intoxicated, insisted he takes us there. He finally agreed. This was the first feeling I got that something seemed off, but no one else was bothered, so I went along with it. When we arrived to the dark alley between some bush about 50 meters from the beach, I didn't hear any music. This is when I got the second off feeling that something wasn't right. The others started making their way up towards the beach to the bar as I followed along. I noticed the driver had parked and followed us up the beach bar. Odd. He was working, so why didn't he drop us off and leave us to continue driving others around the island? As I had suspected when I got to the bar, there was no beach party, just a handful of people sitting around drinking in a dimly lit environment. Again, I got a weird feeling and immediately wanted to leave. I told the others there wasn't a beach party and that we should go somewhere else. But since a lot of the others weren't really moving, no one listened to my pleas. Suddenly, a shirtless thigh guy wearing a bandana bursts into the center of our group, effectively hitting my shoulder in the process, obviously on purpose. He then starts pushing around some of the guys in our group, and even throwing light kicks at them. The guys in our group, being super drunk, start pushing him back. The bad feelings I had started to get worse. If there's one thing I've learned from my travels, it's never mess with the locals. As this was going down, things get a little bit more heated. I decided to start to be very insistent, telling everyone in the group we should leave, since there was no party, and this guy was sketchy. Not to mention our driver was still there. Finally, everyone agreed, and we started walking down the dark alley between the bushes to get to the pickup truck. As I looked over my shoulder, I noticed the Thai guy was following us. At this point, my survival instinct is kicking in hard, and I'm walking faster towards the pickup truck. As we all start loading in, the Thai guy pulls out a gun and begins screaming at us in Thai. None of us have any idea of what he's saying, as he's waving the gun at us and flipping out. We all immediately get down in the back of the pickup, except some of the drunk guys we were with who hadn't made it yet. He was pointing the gun point blank at one of the guys who was fighting back to him earlier. We screamed at him to get in and for the driver to start driving. He did, and thankfully we made it out of there without the Thai guy firing his gun. As we're driving back to the hostel, the whole party mood had been ruined, with a couple of the girls crying the way back. I noticed the Aussie dude wasn't with us at all. Some said to turn back to get him, but the majority wanted to get back to the hostel, so we did. When I got back to the hostel, I met some other travelers who didn't come with us, and told them the whole story. They had some flowers, of the green variety, in which we partook to help me forget what had happened, and it did cause an hour later. One of the guys who was now with me in the pickup truck said, "That was so crazy, wasn't it?" And my response was, "What was?" That seemed to be how it goes with backpacking. Crazy stuff happens, but you tend to move on very quickly. After another hour passed, I was in a daze from more green, and I saw the Aussie guy walk in the hostel. Immediately I was like, "Dude, where the hell have you been?" Apparently he went straight to the bar to drink, and was talking to some guy there. He was so drunk, he didn't even know the whole thing happened, and wondered why we'd all left so early. I filled him in, but he was too drunk to really get how serious it was, or that he had led us to some sketchy bar to potentially get robbed or worse. I hope me and no other traveler ever meets that crazy guy again. This happened in 2016, a week before Christmas Day. I still remember it quite clearly, but some parts of it are kind of foggy. Anyway, on this particular day, my mum decided to take me out shopping with her for some last-minute Christmas gifts and holiday deals. As we're leaving, I grabbed the handbag I was using at the time, a relatively worn but nice black leather Fossil brand backpack. I didn't have much in it besides my planner, a journal, my wallet, and my whole DS case. I'd gone to a gaming party the night before, and it had still been in there, but I didn't think much about taking it out. I was prone to carrying it around in my bag regardless of what I was doing. I never knew when I was going to be bored enough to pull it out and to start tending to my Animal Crossing village or train some of my prized Pokemon. We made our rounds at the mall and whatnot, and about halfway into our trip, I received a text from a high school bandmate of mine. I was a big band nerd and was particularly close with a lot of people who marched with me. The text informed me that some people from my old percussion section were planning an impromptu get-together at the movies, and I was invited to come along, as well as my mum. She was a well-liked band parent, so they had no qualms about her showing up as well. We were both pretty game, and after finishing up at the last store, we headed to the theatre to meet everybody. We had a good time, caught up, took some funny pictures and all that jazz. My mother and I headed home at around 9:30 p.m, and as soon as we pulled into our driveway, my mum asked me to retrieve the bags from our shopping endeavours. I remember that I was listening to my music on my cell phone as I got out of the car and shrugged my backpack onto my left shoulder. I trudged around to the back of the car and stood there waiting for my mum to pop open her trunk. I glanced slightly over my shoulder just in time to see what looked like an SUV whip up on our swale. My first thought was that one of my bandmates had followed me home as a joke. They were a memey bunch, so I didn't put anything like that past them. I smirked a little and turned around to greet whoever it was. But instead of facing a friend, I came face first with a barrel with what looked to be a revolver. Holding it was a short guy. I'm 5'7", and he looked to be slightly shorter than me. He had dark skin, a black, unkempt beard, and unruly curly hair to match. I remember shooting my gaze up at his face and staring at him, because I'd watched enough crime shows to know exactly what was about to go down. "Give me money," he shouted, as we made eye contact. I remember freezing, out of what I could describe as shock and maybe some fear. My first thought was that there was a chance the gun wasn't loaded, followed by the thought that I didn't wish to find out, followed by the thought that I needed to keep my eyes on this dude until he got what he wanted and left. It was at that moment that my mom rounded the back of her car and yelped at the sight of her daughter with a gun to her head. According to what she told me afterwards, she heard the man shout and assumed it was a joke. She came over to give the alleged prankster a piece of her mind. Well, her yelp seemed to alert the gunman, because he took his eyes off me and instead ran over to her. She, of course, ran from him. This is where my fear really started to come into play. Given that the gun was loaded, I became very scared that the man would decide to shoot my mum if she didn't comply with what he wanted. So I ended up yelling, "Just give him your purse." She threw it at him, but then began begging to at least retrieve her car and house keys before he took it. Once again, I became scared that he'd turned the gun on her and told her to shut up. However, the gunman didn't seem to care about her anymore, because now his eyes were on me. He came back at me, waving his little revolver around and repeatedly shouting, "Give me money." I calmly shrugged my bag off my shoulder, and he hastily grabbed it before I even had it off completely. It was then that I glanced over at the car and noticed another man standing at the driver's side door. He was much taller, also dark-skinned, but despite the streetlight, I couldn't make out his face. By this point, my mother ran back towards our open garage, and the gunman seemed to have gotten what he wanted, and started heading back towards his car. I, however, refused to move until they had sped off. I was still entirely frozen in place, eyes still locked on this dude robbing us dry. Just as I thought he was about to get into the car, he noticed I was still clutching onto my cell phone. I was holding it flat against my chest, with my palm covering the majority of it. I was hoping he wouldn't notice it, but those hopes were shot when he came rushing back at me and snatched it out of my hand. He ran back into his car, got in, and they zoomed off. The entire altercation lasted no more than 45 seconds. I'm rather nearsighted, and it was dark, so I failed to see the license plate as they drove away. Once they rounded the corner, my feet finally unfroze, and I calmly, yet hastily, sped-walked into our house and shut the garage door. My mum had turned back to me, as she realized I wasn't behind her when she ran inside. When I got to her, she was already trying to dial 911 on our landline, albeit hysterically. I ended up taking the phone from her and trying to dial on my own, but just our luck. Our landline had been momentarily disconnected due to maintenance issues. This was when I actually fell into panic. I frequently had lucid nightmares about criminal altercations like the one we had just had, and in each time I tried to call for help, the phone wouldn't work. It was just an odd reoccurring thing in my dreams, and to have it happen in real life was really freaking me out. We somehow got it working and got the police on the phone, and before I knew it, our block was covered in cop cars and an ambulance. I got questioned quite vigorously by the cops, and they realized I was the star witness, being that I had gotten a very good look at the gunman. They questioned me as I sat, and deactivated all my cards and whatnot. As I was doing that, it dawned on me that the only real thing of value they got from me in that robbery, besides our purses, was my DS case. I had at least 20 games in that stupid case. On top of the DS, 2,000 of my Pokemon just gone like that. My hacked Animal Crossing village, gone. Just like that. While I was more than absolutely thankful that my mother and I weren't shot, I couldn't help but be slightly chapped about it. I was even more peeved when I ended up having to go down to the police station to do a police sketch, which took over 2 hours. I didn't have a phone, a journal, or my stupid DS to keep me entertained, so you can imagine how excruciating that was. News of the event ended up going viral around our area. Apparently, it had been over 10 years since anything of that nature had happened in our neighborhood, and people were pretty shaken about it. Some idiots at the local news station did a piece on it, and ended up plastering our address all over the news scene. They may as well have painted a damn target on our garage door, and we had to call numerous times to get them to take it down. A few months later, the two morons struck again, a few houses down. They caught the lady of the house in the garage one night and forced her inside. They ended up robbing a lot of stuff, jewelry amongst other things. All the while her husband and younger kids were asleep upstairs. She claimed the short one wore a bandana around his face that time. Since then, we've heard nothing else from the police. As far as I know, they've never been caught. Nowadays, I frame the tale as something more comical. At the time, it was rather surreal and even scary. But having to explain to people how I had my DS stolen at gunpoint inevitably got a few laughs, and I quickly learned to laugh with it. Even though I was, and still am, fairly butthurt that I lost all my stuff. My friends even memed how the news channel spread around our address because of how utterly ridiculous it was, that I even giggle heartily at that too when it's brought up. As for the phone not working when we needed it to, that was more of a momentary fright. I got over it rather fast, and never really thought much of it again. So there you have it. To the two arse-hats who jacked my lovely shiny Sylveon, let's not meet again. I broke up with my long-term girlfriend not too long ago, and that is what led me to online dating. It can be hard for a girl who's interested in girls to find people online. I never had much experience before, or much faith in the system itself, and when I tried all those years ago, I got no results. So that left me bitter and with very little optimism. However, whilst on there, I was talking to a number of people. Not all of them was I interested in. Some of them I saw as only friends for the time being. There was this one really nice girl called Carol. She and I would always chat until it became a regular thing. I was excited and asked to meet her. Apparently, we didn't live too far away. There was a city in between both of us that was roughly equidistant, and we could meet there one Saturday afternoon, I suggested. She said that she would, and so that Saturday, I got all dressed up and made my way there. It was about a 45-minute drive, and I was getting butterflies in my tummy, because I really liked this girl, and I hoped that she liked me too. I sat down in the restaurant parking lot, waiting for her Toyota Prius to arrive, but it never did. Getting frustrated and concerned, I resorted to messaging her via the app to see if everything was alright and that she hadn't had an accident. I didn't receive a reply and went home very disheartened. It wasn't until the next day in the evening did she send me a message. She told me that she had gotten into a horrific car crash and that she wouldn't be able to walk again. I was horrified. I'd met such a nice person for this horrific thing to befall her just because of me wanting to see her, and I felt incredibly guilty. She told me that she would be in touch, and I didn't hear from her for a few weeks. When she got back online, she told me that she had an excellent physiotherapist and that she was now back on her feet, despite her telling me before that the doctor said she would never be able to move again and that she was paralyzed. I tried to dismiss this and told myself that she was probably exaggerating before and that I should just let it go. After chatting for a few more days and making sure she felt comfortable, I even volunteered myself to go all the way over to her city and meet her there, maybe somewhere local for her, just to get her know her in person. She jumps at the offer and agrees, and so I start preparing myself for the date next weekend. That day rolls around, and this time I am very, very excited. We've spoken a lot more, and I genuinely feel like she's someone I can have a very strong connection with. I turn up at the cafe we'd agreed on and wait. I message her to check if she's coming and receive no response again. I wait a few more hours, and at this point I'm wondering if she didn't exist. This is getting too good to be true. The same as before, I get no reply, and the next day she tells me that as she was making her way she got a call from her mother, that her father had had a heart attack, so she had to rush back home 2 states away to make sure that he was okay. And although he suffered a minor stroke, he was fine. I was beginning to get uncomfortable now. I feel like she was lying to me, but I really was getting on fantastically. So for the final time I gave her the benefit of the doubt. We agreed, again, to meet one final time in the city in between ours. This time, I didn't doll up as much as before. I just kind of threw on some jeans and a top, didn't even apply that much makeup, and made my way casually, not wanting to arrive early in case disappointment. When I turn up, to no one's surprise, she isn't there. I don't receive a message, and unlike the other 2 times, something tragic and horrific didn't come through my letterbox during the next few days. I didn't message her. I was pissed, and the least she could have done if something had happened is send me a message for standing me up. I wait, and eventually I get a message on Facebook from someone I don't know called Patrick. He says that he really likes me and asks if I'm bi. I ask him who the hell he is and wonder why he's asking such a weird question. He then openly admits that he's been catfishing me the entire time. I get so angry. I type out the most horrific and obscene things. He played me. He messed with my time, messed with my emotions, and I thought I was having a real connection with someone. And it was all just a sick fantasy for him, in order for him to laugh at my expense. I wanted to report it to the police, but I don't think they do anything for this kind of stuff. I was deflated and didn't use online social media again. This happened before catfishing became a widely used term, though the act itself has been around as long as social media has. This was back during my freshman year of college, and it was during the MySpace era. In college, I made friends with someone in my honors colloquium class, Leslie, and she in turn introduced me to her other friends, who then became my friends. They'd all known each other for years, but were very welcoming to me, and I felt very much like a part of the group. That being said, I didn't really know them that well when this happened. What they did seemed, well, not like them. But then I realized I didn't exactly know what was like them. A member of the group, Catherine, was going away to school in Boston, and so the night before, we all decided to have a going away party of sorts. We were going to visit another friend, Tamara, who was going to school in Philadelphia, which was about an hour away, and then we were just going to have fun in the city. Our designated meeting place to drive down there was a Dunkin' Donuts. When I arrived, Leslie was there with our friends, Samantha and Anthony. Leslie looked pissed. She was sitting there with her arms crossed, staring at nothing, with an angry look plastered on her face. As for Samantha and Anthony, they kept looking at the door, and they seemed nervous and shifty. I could tell they were on edge. I sat down at the table of awkwardness since we had to wait on Catherine and a couple of other friends, and things got awkward when no one was talking. Finally, I just said it. "What's the deal with you three?" Leslie just replied, "You should ask them," gesturing to Anthony and Samantha. They suddenly looked guilty, but before they could answer, the door opened again, and they both went from looking guilty to anxious and mildly scared. I looked at the door and just saw a normal guy, pretty nondescript. When he walked in, he just kind of glanced around the room, like he was looking for someone. Anthony and Samantha wouldn't say anything. Leslie just kept huffing and shaking her head, and all three of them kept looking over at this guy as he sat down. As soon as Catherine and the others got there, it was like we couldn't get out of there fast enough. Catherine, our friends Evan and Julie, and I were very confused. It was on the way to Philadelphia that we learned the truth. It was Leslie who told us. Apparently, Anthony and Samantha had created a fake MySpace account, and they'd been catfishing this guy Calvin. We didn't know the term catfishing yet, but that is what it was. They had created a fake account using a picture of an actress or a singer or something. I can't remember. Only her face was obscured. Apparently this had been going on for a couple of weeks, and the conversations had gotten serious. Like Calvin seemed to really like this fake girl they had created. I didn't know why they did this, and when I asked them, they didn't really have a reason. Mostly they were just bored. It turned out that they'd told him to meet at the Dunkin' Donuts at the time we were there. I think that once he showed up, Anthony and Samantha realized that this wasn't just a game, that Calvin was a real person with real feelings, and I do think they felt bad about what they had done. But it was too late. They couldn't take it back. There was no reason they had chosen Calvin. He was just some random guy they had picked. I guess Leslie had found out about it a few days before and told them to end it. And that was why she was so upset and angry with them, because they had told her what had happened, that Calvin was supposed to be there. After that, I never really saw Anthony and Samantha in the same way. These weren't really people I wanted to be friends with, especially when I saw the messages and saw how much they had gotten Calvin to like him. I thought this would be the end of it, but I was wrong. About a week later, everyone came to my house for pizza and just to hang out, and Samantha and Anthony told us they had gotten messages from Calvin. I didn't think much of it, because I already knew he had been messaging their fake accounts, wanting to know why she had stood him up, and he seemed upset, especially when this fake girl stopped replying. But no, that wasn't what Samantha and Anthony meant. He hadn't messaged the fake account. He had messaged their accounts. I remember them telling me that. My sharp intake of breath, the way my heart rate increased, that unnerved me. The messages were more of the same, but also Calvin made it clear he knew what they had done, and he seemed even angrier. Anthony in particular got a very long, furious message from him. I don't want to say that I thought they deserved it, but honestly they had done a shitty thing, and there were some consequences, and I figured it would die down in a few days. It didn't. A few days after Calvin had messaged Anthony and Samantha, he started messaging the rest of us who'd been drinking in the Dunkin' Donuts. Now this really scared me. Keep in mind that I was already dealing with my other stalker situation, so I was understandably on edge, and this guy had found me. I didn't know much about computers, but I thought he must have traced Anthony and Samantha's IP or something, since they'd used their own computers for the account. But when it came to the rest of us, we didn't understand. How had he found us? My theory is that once he found Anthony and Samantha, he looked through their friends and recognized us from pictures, but I can't say for sure. All of his messages came on MySpace, so at least he wasn't texting us and stuff. But still, his messages were very angry. He kept saying things like, "How could you do this to me? You made a fool out of me." I thought about replying, but Evan had done that already, telling Calvin that we weren't responsible, and he didn't believe him. Honestly, Evan totally sold Anthony and Samantha out, but we figured that Calvin already knew that they were the ringleaders. He just didn't know they were the sole perpetrators, instead thinking we all had a hand in it. I figured there was no point to defend myself, since Calvin didn't believe Evan when he had tried. This went on for a few weeks, and it seemed like Calvin was getting increasingly angrier the more we ignored him, because that's what he said we were doing. Finally, I had enough. I replied and told him again that we weren't responsible, corroborating Evan's story. I didn't actually put all the blame on Anthony and Samantha, but I told Calvin that it was just a couple of people in the group. Then I apologized, although that only made him angrier. He didn't believe anything we said, so I blocked him. We all did, but he just kept making new accounts. In 2 weeks, he probably made 3 different profiles, in addition to the one he had at the beginning. When I finally defended myself, Calvin messaged me back and said, "You made me into a fool, an idiot, and one day you'll know how that feels." I think you will. Maybe it was because of everything else that had happened with this guy, but that sounded like a threat, like he was going to personally make sure we knew how we had made him feel. We were lucky. As far as I know, Calvin never did do anything beyond message us aggressively, and it could have been a lot worse. He eventually did stop, and then he deleted his account. I felt bad for the guy, and Anthony and Samantha had been wrong. But what Calvin was doing to us was wrong too, the harassment. Eventually he stopped though after a few months, and we never saw him again. I slowly drifted apart from the group. First Anthony and Samantha for obvious reasons, then Catherine, Julie, Evan and Leslie. I wasn't too broken up about the first two because they weren't the kind of people I really wanted to be friends with. Not only had they done shitty things, they'd brought Calvin into our lives, and it was like opening a door and inviting someone in. I've been on Grindr for about 10 years, 5 of which were illegal, and I'm not proud of it, and I have had plenty of messed up experiences. This one in particular reminds me of when I was at a party without my car. I was 19 and in college, and my phone was on 10%. But a decently hot Grindr guy said he could pick me up, and we could hang out at his place before he drove me home. So of course, I jumped at the opportunity. We got to his place and he got me pretty drunk, which is not unusual for me, but never tried to make a move. I assumed he was going to just wait and convince me to stay the night later. And finally, my phone died after 2 hours. That last 1% lives a lot longer than the rest. And I didn't even have to say anything before he noticed it was dead. Then he stood up and was like, "Well, let's go to the car then." When I asked if he had a charger I could use, he just said no. After we got into the car, he got kind of quiet and less flirty, and I spaced out just enjoying his music and looking out the window. I didn't even notice that he never asked where I lived, until I'd realized that we had been driving for over an hour, not even towards my town, but into the canyons, Greater Salt Lake City and Utah area, and I asked where he was going, and he just said, thought we could go for a drive. And my drunk ass was just like, oh, okay. So anyway, to make a long story short, he ended up taking us 4 or 5 miles down a dirt road with no signs or houses, until it led to this dead-ended road, with a cabin and no lights or cars. He parked the car and switched it off. That's when the dread started to creep in as I sobered up. I said I drank too much and should probably head home, but he didn't even respond. He just sat there staring at the cabin and was like, "You said you like being kinky. You're pretty submissive, right?" And I was like, sure, but I just meant like normal rough stuff, nothing wild." And he started sounding a little annoyed, and his sentences seemed a little less carefully worded, like he was just spitting out the bare minimum of each thought. He said something about how some of his favorite people are those who can find pleasure in pain, and like if someone goes into shock enough times, eventually, it becomes like a drug and they crave more. Then something about how pushing a person into the deep end is the fastest way to teach them how to swim. At that point, I was scared enough to just assert myself and firmly said, "Okay, well that sounds fun, but just not tonight. I want to go home now and this place is creepy." And he just sighed and gripped his keys tighter. Then, right as I glanced at his phone sitting in the cup holder, right before it occurred to me, he snatched it up so fast and held it in his left hand, kind of behind his head to make it clear he wasn't going to let me near it. I made this kind of, "what?" sound, and he gave me this almost, "I'm proud of you, son," half smile like dads do when they pat you on the shoulder. It was quiet, and he kept looking up and down at me for a minute or so, and then got a little more gruff and said, "Let's go inside. I have these friends you'll really like once you meet them. You'll feel a lot better," or something to that extent. But he wasn't even trying to sound genuine or comforting, like he'd been doing so earlier that night. Finally, I lied and spoke up to him and told him, "I told my roommates and my friends I was meeting up with you before you picked me up. I sent screenshots of your face and some of the convo. They're gonna freak out if I don't charge my phone or reply to them in the next few hours." I tried not to make it sound accusatory, but more like I was just getting worried about my friends going crazy. But it was clear he knew what I was implying. At that point, he let out an exasperated grunt and started the car and drove away, and kept the headlights off all the way back down the dirt road for some reason. Driving back, I got nervous about him stalking me and coming after me in the future, so I tried to apologize and tell him I'd be down to hang out another time, but tonight just wasn't great. He didn't say a single word to me the whole drive back, and didn't ask me where I lived, although I didn't intend to tell him either. But he dropped me off at a McDonald's about 40 miles away from my apartment, and when I was stepping out the car, he suddenly leaned over and gave me a hard shove, so I almost fell out the rest of the way, and he grabbed my backpack off the floor and flung it out his window across the parking lot, and peeled out with the passenger door still open. He broke my laptop, cracked my phone, and I had to ask a stranger to use her charger and call an Uber. But at that point I was just so anxious to get home I didn't give a crap. What's so weird is how, while it was happening, even though I was terrified, I guess I wasn't thinking about exactly what he was planning to do to me. I just knew I needed to get away. So it wasn't until I got home and got into the shower that I realized how messed up all that was, and what might have happened if I'd have let him walk me into that cabin. I remember just being so shaken and smacked by the reality of it, and almost felt like a panic attack. So I sat down in the shower with my head between my knees and cried until it ran cold. I got out, woke up my roommate, just to tell him about it, and he kind of calmed me down. So while I still have a Grindr account, I really just use it as an ego boost. I'm reluctant to meet up with anyone from it now. This story is my cousin's. She has shared these experiences with me since we were teenagers, and the fact that they take place in her parents' house, the house that she grew up. Apparently, before my aunt and uncle bought the home, it was owned by a family who were in a religious cult of some kind. They had to renovate the place just to make it habitable, and the home is on the south shore of Long Island, New York. My cousin had to share an upstairs bedroom with her little sister while they were growing up. She used to wake up suddenly in the middle of the night and see a dark figure standing between her bed and her sister's. She described this thing as apparently to be dressed in a black hooded cloak and having a bone-white face with empty black sockets where the eyes should be. The nose was inhumanly long and pointed, giving it the look of one of those doctor masks that they wore during the Black Plague, if you know what I'm talking about. The mouth was also a gaping black hole. She could see hands sticking out of the sleeves of its cloak, and they were white and skeletal. Her impressions of this was that it was the Grim Reaper, except it didn't carry a scythe. It would just appear, lit up by the nearby windows, and stare at her for a few seconds, and then get up if she looked away and back, and it would be gone. Of course, when she was little, she would get up and run and scream into her parents' room. She swears she wasn't just having nightmares, because it was always the same, and she always got up and ran out the room as soon as she realized what she was looking at. Her sister somehow never woke up to this and never saw the entity. She says she saw the thing about a dozen times while growing up in the house, and it never moved or tried to approach her, except for one time when it raised its bony hand and pointed right at her. Eventually, she left home, went to college, and then wound up living and working in Queens. Her older brother, a police officer at one point, moved back home with their parents for a short while. He confided to her that one night, he was alone in the house and staying in an upstairs bedroom when he heard a loud commotion coming from the parents' bedroom downstairs. It sounded like drawers being opened and slammed and shut repeatedly and violently. Being a cop, his first thought was an intruder was looking to rob the house. He pulled his pistol and headed downstairs to investigate. A sweep of his parents' bedroom, the living room, kitchen, and patio turned up empty. But still nervous, and not convinced that he hadn't just interrupted a robbery, he went back upstairs. Only seconds later did the banging and slamming start up again. Seriously freaked out now, it took him several minutes to venture back downstairs. But once more, there was no evidence of a human intruder found. The drawers were open, but nothing was disturbed and out of place. The final event took place earlier this year. My cousin, who is now in her 30s, had moved back into her parents' house with her husband and 2 children, after living abroad for 10 years. Late one night, her young daughter woke up the house screaming bloody murder when her father rushed into the room to see what was wrong. The little girl said she had seen a long white shape gliding across her room. She was staying in the same room as my cousin, the one that she had slept in when she was a little girl. Shortly after putting their daughter back to bed, telling her it was only a dream, my cousin and her husband heard their son begin to shriek from the downstairs spare bedroom. Being a 2-year-old kid, he couldn't articulate his fear. He just continued to scream inconsolably for hours, and wouldn't settle down until allowed to sleep with his parents. Neither child had ever had an episode like this before. My cousin and her family are still staying in that house, and still sometimes hear weird thumps and bangs around the place at night. No one ever hears the mysterious noise except for at night, and only when they're alone. The other story happened to my brother while he was on active duty in the army and stationed in Schofield Barracks, Hawaii. He was an enlisted military police officer and happened to be on base patrol one night with his partner when their sergeant radioed them and told them they needed to come over to a condemned housing area. Their assignment this night was to drive through the base housing and make sure that no shady activities were taking place. Now, unfortunately, even on military bases, one has to deal with drug addicts roaming around, and sometimes people tend to squat in old abandoned housing areas. This particular neighborhood was full of condemned houses with no electricity, due to be torn down soon. The sergeant said that someone had called to report seeing people in one of the houses, and they would probably need to go in and remove some addicts. That's what they were expecting anyway. My brother and his partner went into the house while their patrol sergeant stayed outside to cover the perimeter in case anyone tried to sneak out the building. First, they did a sweep of the ground floor to include the kitchen, dining room, bathroom, living room, and a pantry. Nothing to be found. But as they were combing each area with flashlights, they heard muffled footsteps coming from the second story. Aha, my brother thought. There's only one staircase, so they can't get out unless they jump out the window. His partner covered the stairs while he swept the second story, which was a long hallway lined with bedrooms and one bathroom. None of the rooms turned up any signs of a person, but they were sure they'd heard footsteps, so this time they both headed upstairs. They not only searched each room, but opened every closet and the bathroom too. Still nothing. Figuring they'd been hearing things, they both headed downstairs to give the house's ground floor one last do-over before heading outside. Meanwhile, their patrol sergeant is walking around outside and can see their flashlights moving through the house. He can also see all the windows. My brother and his fellow soldiers go out to report that they haven't found anything, and perhaps whoever made the call was mistaken. The sergeant is agitated and informs them that as they were covering the ground floor, he saw two human shadows pass by an upstairs window. They must have missed the intruders who were probably still in there. My brother and his battle buddy insist they covered both floors and found no one. But the sergeant isn't convinced and sends them back in to investigate. So the first place they head to now is upstairs. They're searching the first bedroom when they heard footsteps pounding down the hallway, and a door slammed shut at the far end of the hall. They run out of the room and shine their flashlights but see no one. They check every window and every crevice. No one. They think there might be a draft, but it's all closed tight. So they continue checking every room and closet until they get the bright idea to open the attic door. That is one of the bedrooms. That one down at the end of the hallway where the door was slammed shut. My brother's partner has to stand on his shoulders to pull the attic door open because it is in the ceiling. He pulls it open, shines his light around, and there's nothing. For good measure, he pulls out his pepper spray and just crops dust before going back down. Nothing that breathes oxygen could have sucked in all that spray and not made tons of noise, and there's still nothing. At that moment, they both heard a door slam shut on the other end of the hallway. They run down and open the room, but it's empty, and so is the closet. Rather than run up and down the hall at night, not exactly sure what to think, They decide to head back downstairs for good measure. They do one more sweep of the ground floor before heading outside to tell the sergeant no luck. And did he see anyone exiting the house? He replied no. He'd been doing laps around the perimeter and no one had left the property. What's more, he demanded to know how they hadn't been able to catch anyone since he'd been watching them outside the front door. 2 shadows had gone, running by the second-story windows. My brother called me at 3 a.m. just to tell me this right after it happened, voice trembling. I believe that he's sincere. He has never given any thought to being paranoid before, but he's been a believer since then. I worked in a residential care facility, and for a number of years worked with a woman named Kajiri. She was generally okay to work with, but she could be intense. The sort of joking flirtation that often finds its way into high-pressure environments was common throughout the whole team. But when she directed it at me, it didn't seem so jokey. It took me forever to realize that, because I usually don't notice someone flirting with me until someone else points it out 6 months later. But when she started trying to give me jewelry and chocolate bouquets, I finally caught a clue. In between things being normal and actually maybe not really normal, there was a long escalation of text messages, comments that made me uncomfortable, personal space violations, dropping by my house uninvited, hanging around on my shift hours after hers had finished, and unwanted touching. As mentioned, I can be slow to catch on. Once I realized what was happening, I put as much distance between us as possible. I stopped answering calls and texts, locked down social media, and spoke to other colleagues and had them running interference. A lot of interference, actually. At the time, it kind of became a joke, but looking back, it was all kinds of messed up. She even parked outside my house sometimes, and I'd sit in the back room with the lights off so she'd think I wasn't home. Honestly, 2019 me is looking back at 2016 me, throwing popcorn and screaming, "Do something, you stupid cow." But hey, I was alarmingly chill back then. After a couple of months of my disappearing woman act, she seemed to get the hint and backed off. I was pleased. We all got on with our lives and lived happily ever after. Right? No. A few months after it died down, I heard through the grapevine that Kajiri seemed to have focused her attention on another co-worker, Linda. Linda and I had a close mutual friendship, but didn't know each other well. I didn't think much of it beyond, "Good luck, you poor girl." Few months later, and I get a call out of the blue from the mutual friend Linda and I share. Without preamble, he asked, "Were you dating Kajiri?" No. I was shocked. He had been privy to all the awkward details of my experience with Kajiri, and had helped run interference. He explained that he had been talking to Linda, and she'd asked about my relationship. The story that followed still sounds too fantastical to have actually happened in an actual sensible grown-up workplace. Kajiri had been catfishing her own best friend Amanda, posing as Linda. In a string of emails, Linda and Amanda had discussed Kajiri's drug problem, her abusive and dangerous sex, none other than yours truly, and Linda coming out to her family after her brother caught her in bed with Kajiri and more. The jig was up when Linda got a second job, coincidentally with Amanda's husband, who mentioned how great it was to finally meet Kajiri's girlfriend, which puzzled poor, straight, single Linda. Some highlights of the stories Kajiri had been telling to Linda, her friends, and other co-workers I wasn't close to, as she picked her audience very carefully. That Linda and I had physically fought at work over Kajiri. That 2 male co-workers, Kajiri and I, had an orgy in the staff office on a midnight shift. That Kajiri and I had broken up after I cheated on her with another male co-worker. And I was really getting around, apparently. That I would drug her against her will, and that we had planned to have children using a donor, but that I had had a miscarriage. This woman had been living out a full-on soap opera and using her co-workers and friends as set pieces. Linda and I reported her to management, and she was immediately suspended pending investigation. She quit 2 days later. Unfortunately, HR decided they needed to continue their investigation of the allegation that I had an orgy at work, because that was totally plausible and not made up by a crazy woman, right? I left that job a month later myself, and when I interviewed for my current job, she had interviewed half-hour before me, and they were looking for 2 people. She didn't get the job, but there have been 2 openings since, and she has applied for both of them. I'm terrified of meeting her again. It turned out she has a history of inpatient psychiatric treatment for delusional behavior and was known to be obsessive about people she took a liking to. According to Facey, her current girlfriend, whether that be real or not, has a similar first name to me and shares more than a few physical similarities. She still knows where I live. I live in Alabama, in a rural yet woodsy neighborhood in a small town. I was 17 at the time, which was about 2 years ago. I was at home one night, hanging out with my little brother who was 14. We were playing Pokemon Go. This was around the time the app was most popular, and everyone was going out to parks or just the malls to look around and catch some with their friends. We were never the types of kids to go partying or even go out with friends, as our mum felt it would be best to keep us at home. Because in truth, she never wanted anything bad to happen to us. She would always tell us about people she had met before at her work, and that she met. You know the kind. Just people she would consider strangers, whether they were drunk or just being plain creepy. We were smart kids, and knew to always watch our surroundings, and I always kept a pocket knife on me for whatever reason, but mainly protection in case I was put in the position to have to defend for myself and others around me. It was around midnight at the time, and we had been playing for a couple of hours, geeking out over it, as we both used to play Pokemon all the time on our Game Boys, and we loved it as kids. My brother Anthony yelled from the other room in our house, and I could hear him running up to my bedroom door with the biggest smile on my face. "Bro, you're not gonna believe this, but up the road, I don't know, maybe a mile or 2, there's a Ninetales." I was ecstatic overhearing it, and we decided to take a walk through the neighborhood to catch it, along with the other Pokemon we had seen, but none were as important as that. Now, I'm no Pokemon Go fanatic or anything, but just seeing this Pokemon close by made us excited, and we knew we had to get it. So before we got to it, I just wanted to say where we live is usually very quiet, a peaceful neighborhood, without much ever going on. There might be the occasional neighbor walking their dog, or even neighbors yelling, but nothing to ever worry about, especially at nighttime, where it was basically dead. All of the neighbors and anyone around us were usually asleep, or at least all the houses were dark by 11. We headed out of our house and walked down our driveway, which is actually pretty long, being close to 1/4 mile, and then started down the road. The neighborhood itself is basically a very big circle, almost like the letter U. I won't say we lived in the middle of nowhere, but we may as well have been. From the beginning to the furthest in the neighborhood, it reaches about 5 miles total. Just really spread out and simple. While walking, we were having the best time, making random small talk and feeling like rebels for leaving the house, especially so late at night. We walked, it was pretty nice, and the stars were out everywhere, and it was quite chilly. We both caught a lot of Pokemon, and even reached about 3 miles into the backwooded area of our neighborhood just to get this Ninetales. We had been out for maybe an hour at this point, and the childish enthusiasm we had was short-lived. We had gotten bored quickly, considering it was just the two of us, and we did catch what we came for, so we decided it was time to head home. On the way back, we felt completely safe, fearless even, just because of how we were, and we felt nothing could bother us in our quiet little area. As was expected, there were no cars whatsoever out during that late. I don't really know when, but when we were about 5 houses, or what people consider 1 block away from home, we see a car coming from the back of the neighborhood, down this really long road that stretches throughout, and of course, we thought nothing of it. That is until it reached us and slowed down a lot, almost stopping 2 feet behind us. I glanced back to see that it was a red 2007 to 2010 Mustang, with a lot of paint scraped off and the front lights missing. Their windows weren't tinted, but I wasn't able to see anything inside. We were just slowly walking along the side of the road when I realized this was pretty strange considering the circumstances, and I felt pure fear rush through my head all of a sudden. They followed us for maybe 50 feet, which might have been 2 to 3 minutes, when I whispered something to my brother. I can't remember, but it was probably something like, "Man, you know what this looks like, don't you?" And he nodded his head, with concern in his expression. I glanced over to my left, where there was a house with lots of trees surrounding the front lawn, almost blocking the house entirely. Anthony was standing on my right, more so in the road than I was, and this person, whoever it may have been, was closer to him than I was. This person was now driving on the left side of the road near us. The thought of someone jumping out of the car and grabbing him, or rolling down the windows and gunning us down there and then rushed through my mind, with all other types of thoughts as I was trying to figure out what the hell was going on, and what they could be capable of. I'm used to carrying a knife on me at all times, but this was different. It was maybe 4 a.m. now, and I wasn't in the same clothes I had worn the previous day, which usually consists of jeans, which is where my knife was. Now I was in sweatpants and just long-sleeved shirts. How could I have been so careless? But it was then that we both had the same idea. Right as we both saw it in each other's eyes, we bolted up the hill into the yard and into the trees blocking our view from the street. We always thought we were hot shit and could be stealthy or tactile, but this situation really showed us how vulnerable we were. When we reached a point where we knew that they couldn't see us anymore, we dropped down and went prone, or down to the ground on our stomachs, and watched the road from underneath the in-betweens of some trees and bushes while still watching the car. They saw us run away, but it was until we reached our hiding spot that they made a dead stop in the middle of the road for a few minutes. We both lied there terrified, filled with adrenaline from the fight or flight. What he, she, or God willing they might have been wanting or doing was unknown, but all we could think was that they were definitely up to no good. From a dead stop after what I assumed was them visualizing the area, they skirted off at 0 to 60 in 3 seconds, with the engine roaring and tires slightly squeaking. and they were gone just like that. Me and my brother Anthony lied there waiting for what seemed like forever, for both our hearts to audibly stop beating as fast. We had no idea what they wanted, or what could have happened if we just continued walking down the street, paying them no attention, as we would have done if they hadn't have slowed down and followed right behind us. Both of us were visibly in shock. We never said much of anything to each other during those moments. I'm just glad that we were quick on our feet. When we did get up, we ran through the backyards of some houses all the way to ours. We burst in through the back door, locked it, turned off all the lights that may have been on, and went straight to our mum. She happened to be awake and scolded us for going out so late and getting ourselves possibly abducted or worse. We watched out the front window from the house, expecting to see them again, and sure enough we did. That same red Mustang passed in front of our house 3 times, and then we never saw them again. And still to this day, I've never seen the same car. I've seen plenty of red Mustangs. My brother's friend even drives one, but never that one. Call it luck, being blessed, or whatever you want. To all who listen to this, I tell you that we made it away from a confused person seeking 2 kids out walking the long road and piqued their curiosity. Or we made it away from a real threat who decided to follow 2 kids and drive away so quickly in what seemed like they knew they were busted or outplayed. After thinking it over, I'm determined they spotted us and followed us from the deep part of the neighborhood. It creeps me out to this day to think that even though nothing really happened, it could have and might have been. Please stay inside at night. Don't put yourself in a situation that could end badly for yourself or others. Stay alert, watch your surroundings. Always assure your safety for those you are with as well. Be safe, people. And to the person or persons following me and my little brother in the dead of night, I do hope we don't meet again. I remember my high school years. I was very exposed and into dating a lot of guys. I'm now 20, and even though it's been a little over 5 years, call me whatever you want, I don't care, I'm in a happy relationship. In my last year of high school, there was this app going around about asking you questions to another person in their inbox anonymously. And throughout those days of the app, I would keep getting anonymous messages saying, "Oh, you're beautiful. I wish I were with you. I wish you were mine." This was summer break of 2017. Like I said, I was exposed to a lot of guys while the app was a hit. I was dating a guy named Ernie. He was very oblivious about the app, and I started flirting with the guy that had been messaging me anonymously, Chad. Chad suddenly slid into my DMs. I started talking from there, and he confessed that it was him who had messaged me all those things. He was cool. He showed me his SoundCloud music, in which I told him they were lame to begin with. I'm a straightforward person, and I guess he liked that. A month went by and we were talking, and I thought it was just as friends, until he told me that he had feelings for me. Now in my town, everyone knows everyone, whether it's through friends or social media or school. So I kind of knew who he was in a way, but had just never really met him in person. But anywho, I told him that I was single, even though I was still with someone, and started talking to him. 2 weeks go by, and I told Ernie that it was over, because I thought I had feelings for Chad, and I had told Chad that I was into him. A couple of weeks go by from then, and I was dating Chad. But while still speaking to Ernie, one thing led to another, and we ended up hooking up. This made me feel guilty. But being the straightforward person I was, I just let Chad know what had happened, and I did feel bad. He told me what a lot of guys would say. I still love you, it doesn't matter anymore. I still couldn't live with myself. The idea that I had kind of cheated on him, and told him there was no way I was going back to him when I hooked up with Ernie, as in doing so it made me realize I still had feelings for Ernie, and not Chad. This is where he starts to harass me. He was very persistent that he forgave me, and that nothing would change the way he saw me, and I kept saying that I didn't want to be with him. Bear in mind that the time frame of our communication from when I started flirting to when I ended it was about 2 to 3 months. I had to block him on everything I had, Snapchat, Instagram, my personal mobile number, as I thought I'd made it clear I didn't want to have anything to do with him. He would then start making accounts and request me. In the pictures he uploaded, he would write paragraphs about how much he missed me, and that would just creep me the hell out and cause me to block him immediately. He created 12 other accounts and messaged me. They are all from him, telling me how much he missed me, how he was crying and hadn't slept in days. I ignored everything until he started contacting my brother and sister. They showed my dad, who in turn got super pissed at me for causing such a mess. I told him that he'll get over it, and that all Chad needed was time. But I was wrong. For the next 1.5 years, he would create accounts, download apps, and have a temporary number and call me through it. I knew it was him, and never answered. That is until he threatened me. He told me that if I didn't talk to him, he would expose my nudes. Now I worked as a receptionist and had just started having panic attacks, and I began crying and couldn't stop shaking, and I needed to be sent home for the day after that. He did stop for about a month or so, and then went back to it, but this time he would call me with a blocked number. I answered not knowing who it was, because a month or more went by from not knowing about him, and it was Chad. I started going off at him until he began crying. I told him I was going to get a restraining order, and then he said he just wanted to be friends. I thought it would be cool, because I was already going out with someone which is my current boyfriend. So I accepted that we could be friends, until he started calling me names and started questioning me on why I left him. I also needed a better excuse to leave him, and I told him, "You're crazy and need help," and blocked him immediately. I live in the city of Montbello and work in Tustin, and have the morning shift from 5 AM to 2 PM. Every day when I go out to my car to get to work, I see a person from the corner of my street with a black hoodie, always staring in my direction. At first, it was like, whatever, because I live in a ghetto neighborhood and see sketchy things all the time. Then, one day, I told my neighbor to come out with me to my car, as he's a tall, buff guy. When I see the hooded guy in the corner, I yell out to him, "Chad, I'm getting that restraining order on you," and he ran off, never to be seen again. A week passed with no sign of him, until one day I get a call from the blocked number, and obviously I decline it. Ever since I declined the blocked number, I get at least 30 to 50 calls from him every day. I am unable to get the restraining order since I have a very busy schedule. He leaves voicemails, some of him singing, some of him cursing me out, and some of him crying and saying how I was his first girlfriend. On March 13th, 2019, he called me 30 to 50 times a day. I know some will say switch your phone number, but I can't either way. I have 2 times, and he still manages to find me. I don't wish this upon anyone. I just want to be at ease. When I was 15 or 16, My parents moved into a very old farmhouse. There was a family graveyard, not in the backyard, but close enough that I could see it out my bedroom window. It was on the land behind the house, fenced in. The graveyard was so close to our home, it freaked me out. The house itself had 3 bedrooms. I had 2 other siblings at the time, my brother and my sister. My parents kept the room downstairs. There was also an office room that my parents kept a piano in. A living room, dining room, kitchen, long hallway to the bathroom, a back porch, sunroom where we kept our washer and dryer, and then the upstairs was mine and my siblings' room. I call mine a room, but it was just the open space at the top of the stairs. My siblings had to walk through there to get to their rooms. Off of mine and my brother's rooms was an unfinished kind of like attic room, but it was narrow, like you have to bend over to stand in it, and there was 1 light bulb in it and lots of stuff left behind in that area. An old lamp, a mirror, that kind of stuff. There was a door to this area in my room and my brother's. It creeped me out so much. I put my TV stand in front of the door blocking it. Then in my sister's room was a long, narrow, unfinished closet too. That was very cold and dark. It had 1 light bulb as well, but the light didn't work well surrounded by clothing. You see, it had a low ceiling, so you had to duck down if you wanted to go inside, and in order to get to the back, you had to crawl back a ways. Maybe it was because it was unfinished that it gave us the creeps, but my mum put my sister's dollhouse at the end of the closet, and we couldn't bring ourselves to play in there. The first day we moved in, my mum said she saw a man, and he looked angry, walking around the back side of the house. She tried to follow him and ask him what he was doing, but he disappeared going towards the graveyard. As we lived there, things only got weirder. I started wanting to walk out in the field behind our house, closer to the graveyard, and then even weirder, I actually went into the graveyard. Then I got comfortable enough to go and sit in there and read books. When I think about it now, I'm like, what in the world was I thinking? That was creepy. In this graveyard were the graves of babies, adults, and children, and people of all ages. Most I couldn't read, they were so old. But the last name of the family was Suffin, and we called the house Suffin House. I think there were multiple spirits that haunted the house with many personalities. Some seemed kind and harmless. Others seemed angry and mean. My grandma was the first to hear babies crying. She followed the sound all over the house, and it stopped when she reached the bathroom. Sometimes my siblings and I would hear someone call our names. We figured it was our parents, and we would go and ask them why they called us, only to be told that they hadn't said a word. On other occasions, the light in the long hallway would come on by itself. It all seemed harmless, but then my dad said that he would go into a sleep paralysis state, and he said he would feel the sides of his bed bending with the weight of someone sitting on it. He could feel someone lean into his ear and feel their breath whisper names into it. He said it was a woman's voice the first time it happened, and she whispered Hal, which was the name of my mother's stepdad. He didn't think anything of it, but the next day we were told that Hal had passed away. The second name she told him was Sandra. She was a great aunt, and the same thing happened. She passed away the next day from a heart attack. He then started freaking out and wanting to move. He did tell this entity he didn't want to know this, and to please stop telling him. He said he felt like he was going crazy. He said it scared him so much, he was scared to tell anyone. Soon after that, we moved, and I remember the night before we moved out, it sounded like my parents were in the kitchen slamming cabinets. All my siblings heard it, and we all thought my parents were washing dishes or packing. But the next morning we asked what they'd been doing so loud the night before, and they said that it wasn't them, that they'd heard it as well, and gotten up to check, but there was nothing. There was many other small things that happened. All my siblings have their own stories about the house, but that's all stuff that I remember, and that has scared me. I'm going to be honest, I'm a bit of a grumpy tomboy, and I never imagined that I would end up with a would-be stalker, especially not with the career I chose. I was a forensic death investigator. Forensic police officers that generally work with the DA's office and/or the medical examiner's office that look into cases of suspicious deaths, homicides, suicides, and accidents. Occasionally I'd run into people who had a passing interest in what I did because they'd seen CSI or Law and Order a few times. No big deal, right? Wrong. So very, very wrong. It started with a homicide scene I'd been called to at an ungodly hour in the morning, when Mr. Fanboy showed up. He was around his late 30s to early 40s, average height and modestly fit, chattering away with some of the poor unis guarding the scene. Not a big deal. It happens because most people are curious, but then he whips out a camera and starts snapping a few pictures. At that point, I figured he was a really nosy, tone-deaf journalist and decided to give him a polite lecture on how inappropriate it was to take photos of a crime scene, especially when we were getting ready to move the deceased's body. I deleted the pics and sent him on his way, and figured that I'd never see him again. But no! He pops up again a week later at another questionable scene. It doesn't click yet that something is seriously off, until a week after he shows up at yet another scene. This one being a complete county away from the last one. So I worked a major city in Texas, through the medical examiner's office, so we took cases from several surrounding counties, a few thousand square miles. So it was odd that this guy would show up at a rather standard scene on the outer edge of our covered area, even if he was press. I mention it to some co-workers when I get the chance, and they've noticed him hanging around some of their scenes as well. When he showed up again, me and a uniformed officer shake him down and see who the hell he is and why he's got a major hard-on for rubbernecking crime scenes. I'm used to rubberneckers. I get it, people are curious and sometimes a bit morbid when something happens nearby. Once the excitement and newness wears off, they go on about their business. Mr. Fanboy doesn't have a criminal record, not like even speeding or parking tickets. So my superior had a talk with him, basically explained that he was making everyone nervous, and it looked really shady to just start hanging out at crime scenes. So he disappeared for a couple of weeks, before switching to a new tactic. If he can't hang around the crime scenes, why not hang around the investigators? But of course, only the female ones. Fanboy shows up at one of my favorite dive bars that I frequent because it was near my home, over 30 miles from where I work. I'm a 5'7" woman who doesn't look imposing in the least. My co-workers used to tease me that I looked like I was a kid playing dress-up in my uniform. Like most women, I tried to be polite with the guy, who at the time was about 20 years my senior, but declined any offer for a drink. He doesn't take the hint, and chats me up with some of the creepiest shit I've ever heard. What's the worst crime scene you've investigated? Have you ever worked on a case where the victim was dismembered? Do you think any murder cases are really about power dynamics and not sexually motivated? So I'm creeped the hell out. Those are things I don't want to talk about with the therapist, much less with a dude who's giving me some seriously murdery vibes. I completely shut him down. I'm not even trying to be polite, and he seems to be a little put off, but not even apologetic in the least. I went home, put my service weapon back on, and called my supervisor to give them a heads up and start a paper trail for the RO. He was served with a cease and desist, and a few days later, I figured that the threat of an RO and trouble with the police would deter him from escalating any further. Not even 24 hours after the cease and desist, he is back to shadowing crime scenes like it's going out of style. At another female investigator's scene, he's getting into an altercation with one of the uniformed officers. He gets slammed with trespassing, obstruction, and a few other charges, but since he has no record, he's let out on bail, and shows up at a scene I'm working on not 3 days later. We get into a scuffle after he breaks one of my guy's noses to get onto the scene. He's not as strong as he looks, but I still ended up with a black eye. He looked worse by the time my partner and I finally get him cuffed. An investigation is opened, and turned up a police scanner and a lot of creepy journals in his car, as well as notes on where I lived and worked, along with info on one of the other female investigators. From what I heard through the grapevine, his mother's house where he was living was creepy as hell. Yeah, I never thought people would be that obsessed with crime scenes, forensics, or the like, that they'd end up going to jail. But here we are. I'm also very aware that he probably had a lot of unsavory things planned for me and or one of my co-workers, which still makes my skin crawl to this day. So creepy forensic fanboy, who was also probably a Dexter wannabe who watched way too much CSI and Bones, if you ever get out of prison, let's not meet again. I've been a cop since I was 22 years old. I graduated at the top of my class, and I aced all of my exams. As soon as the last sergeant had shaken my hand at graduation, I had a job offer, and I eagerly agreed to fly across the country just so I would be seen as dependable. Even so, nothing that they could have taught me in training would have prepared me for the horror that can stem from living in Vermont. If the freezing temperatures or black bears don't kill you, then there's plenty of other things that will. When I first agreed to take the job as an assistant trainer at the State Police Barracks in Newport, I thought that it would all be pretty green mountains and delicious maple syrup. But I was wrong. I originally hail from Anaheim, California, and I'm convinced that this frigid wasteland will be the death of me. I've always considered myself a tough chick, but I know now that I was woefully unequipped to handle the things that lurk out there. The call that started my living nightmare should have been a standard domestic abuse case, but instead, it ruined my entire perception of reality. In the 3.5 years that I've been here, I've seen humans and animals frozen to death, lumberjacks squished to death by fallen trees, cars that were totaled after running into a gigantic moose, and timber rattlesnakes that are as mean as any diamondback. I thought those were bad enough encounters, but I wasn't prepared to find myself in a situation that I was utterly unprepared for. I had daydreamed about how to get out of tons of different tricky life-threatening scenarios before, but never had I envisioned myself in one that I straight up couldn't figure out how to handle. I didn't have any paperwork left to do last Sunday, and since I'm field trained, I asked my friend Officer T if I could ride with him on a domestic abuse case that had just come in. His partner had already left for the night, so he readily agreed to take me along as backup. As we threw on our jackets and headed out the snow-dusted patrol cruiser, I felt a flutter of excitement. I hadn't gone out in the field for a few months, and I had been itching for some action, now that most of my recent classes had graduated. I looked over the notes, ingraining into my mind that we needed to speak with a Mr. B, who was the suspected wife-beater. Officer T and I drove for about 15 minutes, eventually finding ourselves on one of those pothole-covered roads that Vermont is famous for. The snow was up our thighs, and even our tactical SUV was having some trouble getting up a few of the icier hills. We cursed our luck at being sent to a residence out in the countryside, especially since it was about 7 p.m. and it was pitch dark out. A concerned neighbor had called us, and when we got to Mrs. F's house to hear her report, the distressed woman told us that there were strange screams coming from the creek area behind the houses. We had been under the impression that the fighting had been occurring inside her neighbor's house, and she said that it had been until about 10 minutes before our arrival. She led us out to her back porch, and sure enough, after stepping through the doorway, we heard the screams. They were very hard to describe. They sounded like a low-pitched version of a frantic woman yelling. Each scream lasted anywhere between 3 to 10 seconds, though it never sounded like it was saying actual words. It was a cry of sheer terror, stuck on an infinite loop, and my adrenaline was pumping so hard, I didn't even want to bother knocking on Mr. B's door. Normal protocol dictates that we should go next door and question the suspects, but under circumstances where someone is clearly in trouble, we're allowed to prioritize the public's safety over standard inquiries. We sprinted from the porch, making our way as quickly but carefully as we could towards the sound. Officer T and I heard 2 more screams, which were getting louder as we approached the creek. We were both getting a little unnerved. As we made our way into the woods, we quietly discussed if it could be an animal. The screams of a mountain lion can sound just like those of a distressed woman, and our little flashlights weren't doing much to illuminate the shadow-filled forest. We were finally approaching the creek bed, and we hadn't heard a scream for about 5 minutes. We had begun calling out for somebody to come forward if they were there, or to help lead us to them, but there was no more sound. I began checking for footprints, and there were only ours, and something that looked vaguely deer-like. The powdered snow that we were kicking up was causing a fine sheen of mist-like coverage, but even so, we did a thorough sweep of the area, and hadn't seen any signs of blood or a struggle. Officer T and I were just about to turn back and head for the car, when the air around us erupted into a cacophony of shouting, screaming, and savage howling. We were both startled, and I could see my confusion echoed in his face. I opened my mouth to make sure that he was experiencing the same crazy phenomenon that I was, and then we heard an exact copy of this scream from where we were on the porch. It came from directly behind us, but there was nothing there but an open clearing. Officer T resolutely marched into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing to investigate, and then there was another chunk of silence for several minutes. I didn't even hear his footsteps crunch, and I was starting to get anxious. About 10 minutes later, he emerged from a different direction, and for a split second, I thought I saw his eyes shine red in the beam of my flashlight. I dismissed the thought. knowing that the glint of snow off the light was playing tricks on me. Officer T beckoned me over, but I told him that we needed to get out of there. He looked almost angry for a moment. Then, he crossed the clearing to me. I watched with unease as he plowed awkwardly through the snow, stumbling like he had been drinking. I was about to ask what was wrong with him when an odd cry came from our right, and I nearly screamed out loud. That was the last straw for me. I grabbed Officer T's arms and all, but I dragged him through the snow, keeping a firm grip on his bicep so that he wouldn't stumble again. I was about 60 pounds lighter than him, but my adrenaline was pumping so strongly that I was able to get through the snow and up the hill like it was nothing. Just as we got halfway up to the house, the scream came once again. It was so loud that it seemed to be right next to me, and I frantically shone my flashlight around. There was nothing. In that glacial Vermont forest, there was no glinting of animal eyes, no rustling of bushes, no sound of footfalls, just tense silence. As I frantically traced our steps back to the house, a desperate wail sliced through the air. And it almost sounded like my name. It lasted for about 10 seconds straight, and it was much louder than before. By this time, I was terrified, but I kept my wits about me enough to stop and tell Mrs. F to call us if anything else occurred. She never did call again, and I got us out of there as fast as the cruiser would safely go. I still don't know what was in those woods, but even as an avid outdoors woman, I know no animal makes that kind of wail. One thing in particular which still gives me shivers is how completely silent between the screams it was. That might not seem odd, but during the harsh winters in Vermont, there's still always some type of ambient sound when you're in a forest, even if it's just the lonesome cries of non-migratory crows, or the wind causing bare branches to rub together. There's always something. That night though, even back by Mrs. F's house, away from the source of the wailing, there was no sound. Whenever I bring this up, Officer T just says the same cryptic sentence, and he tells me I should be glad we got out of there alive, because the danger was closer than I knew. It was the summer after 4th grade, and I had just come home from Girl Scout camp with a newfound appreciation for archery. Wanting to foster this unexpected interest in their otherwise very uncoordinated, non-outdoorsy child, my parents decided to buy me a bow and a quiver of practice arrows, and I ended up spending much of my time until school began out in our backyard shooting the side of a foam target. My parents' house is out in the middle of nowhere, with several miles separating it from most of the other neighboring properties. Even so, we knew all of our neighbors well. It's the sort of area where families tended to take up roots and stay up for generations. I never felt scared being alone outside by myself, even as a young girl. In retrospect, there was something comforting about the isolation of living on a property spanning several acres. As familiar as our neighbors were, the only time I ever really saw them was when they would drive past my house on the way to or from work. I knew their schedules, so I knew when to expect them. And other traffic on the narrow rock besides my house was rare. So much so that if my family and I heard a car go by in a while, we would go to the window to see who it was. With all of that being said, a day came where I suddenly had reason to fear one of my neighbors. I was playing outside with my bow and arrow when an old white pickup truck appeared at the top of the hill coming towards my house. The rock road it was driving down ran adjacent to where I was standing in the yard, with a ditch full of wildflowers in between, and so when the truck slowed to a stop next to where I stood in the yard, I began grasping at mental straws, trying to remember everything I'd ever learnt about stranger danger. Even then, though, I tried to place the face of the man now rolling down his passenger side window. Maybe I did know him. Maybe my parents did. Why else would he be here? There's nothing out here for anyone who doesn't live here. But I didn't recognize him. He leaned over, still buckled in, towards his now open window. "Are those your dogs?" he asked me. I was completely unprepared for such a question. I'd been holding my bow down but ready. I even had an arrow already nocked, because I had been about to take another shot when I saw him pulling up. My last shot was pretty close to being a bullseye, so I felt hesitantly reassured by this potential line of defense against the strange man in the truck. Even then, though, I knew I wouldn't use it. I was just having desperate, nervous, childish thoughts. "Are those your dogs?" he said again, gesturing to my golden retriever Disco and my poodle mix JC. My dogs had free roam of our yard, but this was a very normal thing in our area. Them being outdoors and untethered didn't seem like a likely motivator for his question, but I couldn't imagine why else he'd ask. I told him they were, now beginning to wish I wasn't outside alone. He started complimenting them and mentioning how he saw them when he drove by, and asking every few sentences whether I was sure they were ours. At this point I was very uneasy, and perhaps it showed. He started explaining that he was my neighbor and had moved nearby not long ago. It was around this point that my mother came running up to where I stood in the yard. She had apparently seen me from the window talking to the man, and obviously wasn't about to let that continue. "Can I help you?" she asked. He gave her the same spiel as he did to me about where he lived and about the dogs being beautiful. He asked her, as he had done with me, if they were ours, this time adding that he had been about to pick them up and keep them for himself if they were not. He said this with a friendly tone, as if it were a completely normal thing to be saying, but my mum wasn't having it. Like me, she said they were, and after a while more of this back and forth, he drove away. After that, someone always stayed outside with me while I was playing, but this didn't stop him from coming back a few days later. He asked all the same questions and made all the same comments about our dogs, and my mum gave him all the same responses, this time being a little more tense. Yet again he drove away, and then for a long time nothing else happened. Eventually though, stories of dogs going missing began cropping up. I didn't even think about the man, honestly, because it had been a while since we'd seen him, and it wasn't the first time dogs had been stolen from people's yards in the area. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of. A while later, my family and I were sitting down to have dinner and were watching the news. As we finished up, a story came on about a man who had been running a puppy mill out of his yard. The anchor described how cages were found stacked on top of another when the police busted the property. That several dogs, dozens of them, alive and dead, were found on the premises. The dogs that weren't clammed together in the cages were tied up, and the ones who didn't make it had been burned by the man running the mill in a pit. The police found it to be full of remains. When the anchor described the location of the operation, I was shocked to hear how near it was to where I lived. Then it struck me. They never showed the man responsible, but I was sure it was him. Things obviously quietened down after his arrest, but about a decade later, just a year or two ago, I got a text from my mum. Both JC and Disco have since passed, but my parents now have a German Shepherd named Bailey. In the text, my mum said how a strange woman kept stopping by the house and doing the same things the man had done. She claimed to be a neighbor and talked about how she and her husband didn't live far away. Unlike the man years ago though, who my mum and I believe is likely her husband, she also made comments about how she had been giving Bailey treats when my mum wasn't home. She referred to herself and Bailey as good friends, and kept going on about how she would often drop by during the day and bring her out to the road with food. My mum did not take this well and asked the woman to stop. She hasn't been seen since, and Bailey is fine, but I could hardly believe to hear it was happening again. As much as I wish there were a stronger conclusion to this, there really isn't. All I can say is to hug your pets tight tonight. There are some sick people out there.